We think the past is gone, that it's sealed away in books, in museums, in silent ruins too old to remember their own stories. But the ground still keeps secrets. A sealed tomb in Rome, a Viking sword with no rightful owner, a fortress with no hill, no advantage, and yet no defeat. Some mysteries were never meant to be found, and some were always waiting for someone like you to listen. These aren't just ruins, these are forgotten puzzles, each one buried under cities, farmlands, grocery stores, or centuries of silence. Tonight, we uncover what was hidden beneath. Let's begin. The tomb sealed with 8 iron staples. There are tombs, and then there are silences. Not the kind that sits in the room after a conversation ends, but the kind that rests beneath the ground, sealed for centuries, never meant to speak again. In the year 2021, deep in the Italian countryside, archaeologists stumbled upon a forgotten slice of history. Buried under layers of soil and olive roots, they found a Roman tomb completely untouched. No signs of looting, no signs of disturbance, just stillness, and what sealed it shut. 8 thick iron staples. Deliberate, strong, like the ancient hands that placed them there, never wanted what was inside to be disturbed. Ever. But they opened it anyway, and what they found was not a warrior, not a nobleman, not even treasure. They found her. A woman. Nameless. Silent. Forgotten. She had been lying there for over 1600 years. Her bones arranged with care, her wrists gently crossed, her face forever turned slightly toward the left, as if in sleep. There was no inscription, no epitaph, no offerings. Just her, and the iron staples that held her story shut for over a millennium. And yet, even without words, this tomb spoke, not in sound, but in feeling, the chill of ancient sorrow, the weight of a life lived and lost, the way sand remembers footsteps after the walker is gone. We don't know her name, but we know this: someone cared enough to bury her deep, to lock her tomb with 8 iron staples, to build silence around her, not just protection, but permanence. And when we look closer, there's something oddly meticulous about it all. The staples weren't just shoved in at random, they were carefully placed, like stitches over a wound, as though her tomb had been sewn shut by grief itself. Why? Why seal a single woman away with such determination? There were no riches, no royal jewelry, no golden circlet pressed to her skull, and still, 8 iron staples. That number sticks with you, doesn't it? Not 4, not 6, 8. Even numbers, perfectly split, balanced, symmetrical. Was it superstition, or a ritual we've long forgotten? And what if it wasn't to keep looters out, but something else in? These are the thoughts that echo through archaeology labs. Theories pile up like dust. Was she a feared outcast, a revered oracle, a victim of a curse, or its keeper? Some scholars believe it was a plague burial, that she died during one of Rome's many deadly outbreaks, locked away to prevent the spread of disease. But if that were true, why such care in her burial? Why the precise iron? Why the sealed tomb, far from the chaos of mass graves? It doesn't quite add up. Others whisper of ancient rituals, of women who saw visions, who knew things they weren't supposed to. The kind of woman you bury deeply, the kind you seal behind metal, just to be sure. And maybe she was one of those women, not cursed, not evil, but powerful in her own way. The kind of power that makes people nervous. In Roman times, burial was not just a practical matter, it was spiritual, symbolic. Where you were buried, how you were buried, what surrounded your body, these things told your story long after your name was gone. So what does this tomb say? It says, she mattered. Someone stood above that grave long ago, holding heavy staples in one hand, tears in the other, and whispered goodbye, not knowing that goodbye would last 16 centuries. Iron lasts, grief lasts longer. When we peer into her tomb now, we don't just see bones and dirt, we see what isn't there. No offerings, no tools, no weapons, just her, and silence. It's haunting, in the softest way, like walking through a forest at night, when the wind stops and the leaves hush. She lies there still, peaceful maybe, or waiting. Her teeth showed no signs of struggle, no fractures, no trauma, no pain that archaeologists could identify. It's as if she simply left. Gone like smoke in the wind, gone like a thought you can't remember the next day. Maybe she wasn't important to history, not a queen, not a legend, but to someone, she was everything. Someone knelt by that stone slab, someone pressed those staples into the frame, someone lit a final candle and walked away with ashes in their heart. And now we stand in that same spot. Centuries later, the candle's gone, the staples rusted, the tomb open. But her story is only just beginning to echo again. It's in the way we wonder, in the way we pause before sleep, in the ache of questions with no answers. Who was she? What did she see? What did she love? Did she laugh loudly? Did she sing to herself? Did she believe in the stars? Did she fall in love? Did she cry when it ended? Was she afraid? there at the end, or was she ready? We'll never know, but we can imagine, and sometimes that's enough, because the mind fills in what history forgets. It sketches faces over skulls. It builds memories from fragments. It turns silence into story. And now, here we are, sitting together, in a dark room, hearing her again. The tomb was sealed with 8 iron staples, but time always finds a way through. Arrowheads in the shallow grave. The wind doesn't shout here, it whispers, soft and low, like it's remembering something long forgotten. Beneath a moss-covered stretch of earth, where the sun flickers through pine branches like old memories blinking in and out of existence, a discovery was made. It wasn't grand, it didn't scream for attention. No gold, no crowns, just a shallow grave in the middle of nowhere. But it was enough. The archaeologists nearly missed it. There were no stones, no wooden planks, no engraved markings, just a faint depression in the ground, an unnatural dip in the forest floor, barely deeper than a bed of leaves. A test dig began. Hours passed, and then, bones. Human bones. Fragile, weathered, ancient. The skeleton had been folded slightly, knees drawn in, almost fetal, almost peaceful, as if even in death, the man within this grave had curled into himself, bracing against the cold. They knew right away he was Viking. The bone structure told them. Broad shoulders, worn joints, a life of motion, of wilderness, of hunting, perhaps. A man who didn't just live in the landscape, he moved with it. And beside him, resting gently along his ribs and down the line of his hip, they found something that paused the excavation. Arrowheads. Not just 1 or 2, but 7 in total. Still sharp, still lethal. But the shape was wrong. Or maybe perfectly right. They were heart-shaped, not polished, not ornamental. These were tools of survival, weapons. But each one was undeniably crafted in the form of a heart. Wider at the top, tapering into a deadly point. They were purposeful, that much was clear. But why? Why would a hunter, a warrior perhaps, be buried with arrows shaped like love? It's a strange thing, isn't it, to find love in a weapon? Some say they were romantic symbols, that he had died in the name of love, or carried these weapons as offerings to a lost companion. Others say they were spiritual, that each arrow represented a soul, either taken or protected, that the shape wasn't meant to symbolize emotion, but the fragility of life itself. And then there's a darker idea, that the arrowheads were carved that way deliberately, to leave a mark no enemy would forget. Imagine being struck not just by iron, but by a shape burned into memory, a heart, a hunter's love, or curse. But the grave held more. The body wasn't alone. Nestled near the knee, beneath layers of mud and time, they found a pendant, made of bone, roughly carved, but again, heart-shaped, this time cracked down the middle. Was it broken before the burial, or had time fractured it afterward? No one can say, but the story deepens. The grave wasn't dated to the height of the Viking age. No, this one was older. Predating the raids, predating the settlements. He had lived in a time when the lines between myth and man were thinner, and that raises the question. Was this a grave, or a warning? See, in Norse folklore, the heart was sacred, not just as a symbol of love, but as the keeper of memory, the seat of honor. To strike through the heart was to claim more than life, it was to erase memory, to sever legacy. If his arrows were shaped like hearts, could it be that each one was meant not to kill, but to silence? And what of the pendant? Was it a memory he carried? A piece of someone he lost? We'll never know his name. The wind won't give it up, the bones won't say. But we can imagine. A lone hunter, carving his own story into iron. Maybe he was in love. Maybe he was betrayed. Maybe he crafted those arrows not to kill animals but to track a ghost. Or maybe he just liked the shape. Maybe the heart wasn't about romance or war, but about focus, precision, art. It's easy to forget that even in brutal times, people created things that spoke. A blade wasn't just for survival. Sometimes, it was a message, even a whisper. Some say the shallow grave was accidental, that he died alone, far from home, and was buried hastily. But the care with which the arrowheads were placed, the precise alignment, the pendant carefully wrapped in hide. No, this wasn't quick. This was ceremony. A private goodbye, perhaps by someone who couldn't speak the words aloud. Maybe she stood there, alone in the mist, placing each arrow beside him like a sentence. Maybe she was the one who carved them. We imagine her hands, weathered, red from the cold, folding the fabric, tucking the last arrow under his ribs, not to arm him for war, but to cradle him in memory. Because sometimes the past doesn't roar, sometimes it sighs. There are no saga scrolls about this man, no ancient poetry, just bones, iron, and silence. But maybe silence is enough. The soil has kept his story safer than any ink ever could. And now, for the first time in centuries, the world leans in and listens. Would he have wanted that? Perhaps not, but maybe the one who buried him did. Maybe those heart-shaped arrowheads weren't weapons at all. Maybe they were love letters, written in iron, buried in frost, and finally, heard. Beneath the supermarket floor, the wind god's temple. There's something almost poetic about the way ancient places hide themselves. They don't shout, they don't glow, they simply wait, tucked under centuries of footsteps, buried beneath concrete and steel, patient beneath the lives we build above them. And sometimes the past chooses the most ordinary places to reveal its face. Like beneath a grocery store aisle, where baskets rattle and children tug at their mothers for candy. It happened in Mexico City. Construction workers were making routine repairs to the foundation of a supermarket. Just another day beneath humming fluorescent lights, where history seemed the farthest thing from reality. But when they dug deeper, the ground answered back. The soil shifted differently. The layers didn't behave as expected. And then, the stone appeared. It wasn't just a slab. It was carved, weathered, deliberate, and surrounding it were remnants of something unmistakably sacred. A circular platform, intricate masonry, charred offerings, bits of obsidian, traces of incense ash still clinging to crevices. The past had been sleeping quietly beneath shopping carts and cereal boxes. They had found a temple, more precisely, a shrine to Ihekal, the Aztec wind god, one of the quieter gods in their pantheon, but no less vital. The god of breath, of movement, of storms, the god who brought the rains and whispered through the valleys long before we called them streets. It's believed this particular temple once stood on the outskirts of the ancient city of Tenochtitlan, a metropolis so vast and organized it amazed the Spanish conquistadors when they first arrived. This shrine, once part of a grand ceremonial complex, had been covered during the colonial rebuild. Over the centuries, layers of Spanish, then Mexican architecture stacked over it. The jungle of civilization grew tall, and yet the wind god remained where he always had. Patient, forgotten, silent. What the workers discovered was just a fragment, but it was telling. The temple's shape was almost shell-like, curved and aerodynamic. This was intentional. According to Aztec belief, Ehecatl didn't just rule the wind, he moved with it. His temples were designed to reflect that motion, the rounded corners, the spiral carvings, the doorways angled like gusts. It was a structure made to breathe. Archaeologists moved in quietly. Bit by bit, layer by layer, they uncovered ceremonial floors, offering pits, burnt seeds, feathers, and fragments of pottery with painted eyes and curved beaks, symbols of the god's avian nature. Every inch seemed to hum with old reverence. Every grain of dust felt like it had once been prayer. But what's truly haunting isn't just that a god's temple was hidden under a store. It's that nobody noticed for so long. Generations of people bought groceries above a sacred place. Toddlers learned to walk. Teenagers bagged apples. Grandmothers counted pesos. All while below them, one of the great deities of Mesoamerica rested beneath their feet, unseen. And maybe, he liked it that way. Ehecatl wasn't a god of thunder or fire. He wasn't loud or angry. He was subtle. He was breath. He was the hush between the leaves. Maybe that's why he stayed buried, wrapped in soil and the scent of old maize. Maybe he was listening. There's a strange comfort in the idea that the divine doesn't disappear. It simply waits. That even when we forget, the earth remembers. That gods don't need gold or ceremony to linger. Sometimes they just need space, and silence, and time. Today the site has been preserved. A portion of the supermarket has been remodeled, not removed but respectfully altered. Part market, part museum. A strange blend of sacred and mundane. A place where you can pick up tomatoes and just steps away, look down into the heart of a vanished empire. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other temples rest beneath our feet? How many stories lie curled under parking lots and playgrounds and patios? How much of the past have we built over without ever knowing? And maybe more importantly, how much is still breathing beneath us? Because if a wind god can sleep beneath a grocery store, what else waits in silence? The giant coins buried in straw ropes. They didn't expect to find anything that day. The workers were just digging. The land had already been cleared. The permits were signed. A new foundation was being laid. Just another building in a quiet rural town in China's Hunan province. But beneath the layer of dry earth and rock, their tools struck something odd. Not rock, not wood. It clinked, repeatedly, and not just once. Metal. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. What they had uncovered wasn't part of any modern system or leftover industrial scrap. No, what lay beneath their feet, woven into bundles of long disintegrated straw rope, was something far older and far heavier. They had uncovered what would soon be recognized as 1.5 tons of ancient Chinese coinage, stacked neatly, deliberately, and buried like an offering no one was meant to retrieve. Each bundle had once been tightly tied in straw, rotted now, but its form still suggested careful packing, like someone had prepared it for travel and then never followed through. And the coins. They weren't like the ones you or I know. These weren't round, solitary, jingling pieces of pocket change. These were spade-shaped, square-holed bronze coins, thousands upon thousands of them, likely cast during the late Western Han Dynasty or earlier, a time when value wasn't printed, it was cast, when a coin was a tool, a blade, a symbol, a power. But here's where the story begins to slow down. Not just because of the weight of those coins, but the weight of the question, why would someone bury so much and never come back for it? The coins weren't tossed in haste, they were organized, grouped, banded tightly in straw rope. Even the placement of the bundles, archaeologists noted, seemed too tidy for an accident. It wasn't hidden in a cave. It wasn't shoved in a wall. It was buried flat, below the earth, as though someone had followed a plan. Some believe it may have been a secret treasury, hidden during a time of uprising. The Han period was one of peace on the surface, but beneath it, revolts, famines, warlords vying for territory. A merchant, maybe even a local governor, might have seen the warning signs and done what they could to preserve their wealth, bury it, wait for things to calm down, then retrieve it later. But no one ever came back, and the question lingers like a shadow in the soil. Why not? We don't know the name of the person who buried those coins. We don't know if they were rich or powerful or desperate. But what we do know is this: that person cared enough to hide their fortune in a way that took time. They trusted the earth. They wrapped each bundle carefully, and they buried them not too deep, but deep enough that only time, not weather or war, could erase their footsteps. And perhaps they thought they'd return in a day, or a week, or when it was safe again. But days turned to decades, then centuries, and the coins, wrapped in silence, waited, not for trade, not for value, just to be remembered. Some believe these coins were part of a ritual, a spiritual offering, meant to protect a household or appease the spirits of the land. In ancient Chinese folklore, bronze coins weren't just money. They were warding charms. Strings of coins would be hung over doors, buried under homes, placed in tombs, carried for luck, to ward off evil, to bring wealth in the afterlife. Could this have been a massive spiritual deposit? Could someone have believed that protecting their land required more than prayer, required material wealth? If so, then these weren't just coins. They were hopes, worries, sacrifices, the equivalent of pouring your entire future into the earth and asking for safety in return. And it's strange, isn't it? That something so heavy, so valuable, could be forgotten, or maybe not forgotten, maybe intentionally lost. Because what happens when a family dies without descendants, or when a merchant flees and never returns? What happens when the purpose of something is known only to the person who hid it, and that person vanishes from history? You're left with coins, just coins, but coins that were never meant to be found. When the archaeologists took them out, one by one they realized how fragile everything else around them had become. The straw was gone, barely traceable. The soil had shifted, the air smelled old, and yet the coins had survived. Bronze lasts, but even bronze, when buried with memory, feels different. One of the lead archaeologists noted, "It's like we're reading someone's secret plan, but we only have the punctuation." Imagine the night they were buried. No noise, just moonlight. Maybe a small cart pulled by an ox. The bundles creaked under their weight. A few men, cloaked, sweating despite the cold, lowering heavy packets into the shallow pit. Maybe they said nothing, or maybe they said too much. And when it was done, they patted the earth flat again. No marker, no sign, just soil, and then they left, turning their backs on what may have been their entire life savings. Maybe they planned to return, but time doesn't wait. And now, what they left behind has become part of a larger story, one they didn't get to finish. Coins are supposed to move. They're meant to pass through hands, to jingle in pockets, to disappear into markets and reappear somewhere else. But these coins never moved. They never even got their chance to serve. Their lives began in fire, cast in the heart of a furnace, hammered into shape, cooled in water, and ended in silence. And yet, isn't that a kind of poetry? To be made with such care, and then to rest, untouched in the earth for over 1,000 years. To sleep while empires rose and fell. Sometimes the most powerful part of a mystery is its stillness. And in this case, it wasn't what was stolen, it was what was saved, and never spent. Shakespeare's kitchen and the forgotten cold pit. Somewhere in the heart of Stratford-upon-Avon, not far from the cobbled lanes where horse hooves once echoed like soft thunder, there lies a stretch of earth that remembers more than it shows. Tourists pass by, snapping photos of quaint Tudor beams and half-forgotten plaques. They see Shakespeare's name etched in every corner of the town, but beneath those historic layers, under ordinary soil and gentle moss, the poet's private world still lingers. silent, cold, and mostly untouched. What if I told you that the soul of Shakespeare's home, the place where he cooked, where he warmed himself by fire, where he walked barefoot across chilled morning floors, was buried just beneath the noise of modern life? Not in the pages of a book or the lines of a sonnet, but in the earth itself, in the ash of an old hearth, in the stone lining of a forgotten cold pit, in the scent of burnt barley still clinging to the brick. When archaeologists began carefully unearthing the remains of New Place, Shakespeare's last home, their focus was mostly structural. Where were the rooms, the gardens, the courtyard? But what they found next was something gentler, quieter. Not a grand hall, nor a towering wall, but the subtle outline of a kitchen, a brewhouse, a cold pit, the parts of a house that rarely get attention. Yet these were the very spaces where life quietly happened, where breakfast sizzled, where beer fermented in the shadows, where someone, perhaps Shakespeare himself, retrieved apples from cool storage on a summer morning. The floor was made of flagstones, weathered but firm, and beside the hearth there were signs of heavy use: charred wood, cracked pots, and ash scattered like forgotten punctuation. This wasn't a kitchen built for show. It wasn't royal or extravagant. It was a working hearth, used every day. A place of early risings, of meals shared quietly, of fatigue and routine. And yet, if you lean in close enough, you can almost hear the whisper of a kettle whistling, or the soft clink of tankards passed between friends. The brewhouse, they discovered, was tucked right next to it, separate but close enough to share warmth. In those days, ale wasn't a luxury. It was daily fare, safer than water, brewed in batches and shared generously. Shakespeare's wife, Anne Hathaway, likely oversaw the brewing. She would have steeped the grain, stirred the wort, and kept time with instinct. No recipe written down, just years of knowing. That's how old kitchens worked. By memory, by rhythm, by feel. One of the most peculiar discoveries was what they called the cold pit. It wasn't dramatic, just a hollow carved deep into the kitchen corner, lined with stones to keep it cool. But that pit had purpose. It stored the perishable, the precious, the butter wrapped in cloth. The milk kept cool. Perhaps a joint of meat from a recent slaughter. And maybe, just maybe, the odd bottle of imported wine, held aside for evenings when the writing stopped and the world quieted down. You can imagine Shakespeare standing above it, the door creaking open, the cold brushing against his skin like a forgotten wind. These weren't the moments of applause or fame. They weren't scenes fit for a stage, but they were his moments. Domestic, private, slow. The world often forgets that he lived a full life outside the theater. He argued, he laughed, he lost his temper, he fetched his own ale. He likely grumbled about drafts, misplaced things, waited too long for bread to rise. There's something deeply grounding in that, because we often paint great figures as distant, untouchable. But here, in this kitchen, he was just a man. A tired man maybe, a hungry one, a husband, a father, someone who warmed his hands by fire before dipping them into dough. What's even more moving is the sheer ordinariness of it all. The worn brick, the soot stains on the walls, the remnants of a wooden shelf where herbs might have hung to dry. These weren't the remnants of fame, they were the fingerprints of routine, and in that, there's something oddly beautiful. Because these small traces, these echoes of domestic life, are so often lost to history. But not here, not entirely. As excavators brushed away the centuries, they found bones too. Not human, but animal. A pig's jaw, a chicken's claw, leftovers from meals long gone. They speak of feasts and hunger, of celebrations and simple sustenance, of a house that fed people, day after day. They even found broken pottery, some of it local, some of it not. One shard in particular carried a faint glaze, likely once part of a decorative pitcher or jug. Perhaps it had held cider from a nearby orchard. Perhaps it shattered during a family quarrel or a careless slip. Even those accidents now whisper stories. The hearth itself was wide, with space enough for more than one pot. That meant meals weren't just reheated. They were layered, simmered, stewed. Time was an ingredient too, and patience, just like in writing. In fact, if you step back and really listen to the rhythm of the kitchen, it's not so different from the rhythm of his plays. A pot bubbling slowly mirrors a line building toward climax. The beat of chopping herbs falls in pace with iambic pentameter. The hush of the cold pit is not unlike the silence between acts. Even in this kitchen you can feel it, the poetry beneath the practical. Outside, in what once was a garden, researchers found impressions of footpaths. They believe herbs were grown here, maybe rosemary for the bread, sage for broth, lavender for rest, and among them, bees. Always bees, buzzing softly, drawn to clover and thyme. Even now the scent of soil lingers. If you close your eyes, you might imagine it, the blend of smoke, yeast, and something sweet. A place that always smelled like something was about to be made. A place of beginnings. This isn't the story that history books usually tell. They tell of his fame, his patrons, his plays performed before kings. But this story, this quiet, earthy story, it holds a kind of intimacy the others lack. It places your feet where his once stood. It lets you feel the warmth he felt, the hunger, the comfort, the small satisfactions of home. And maybe that's the truest glimpse we'll ever get of him. Not in marble statues or oil paintings, but in the soot of his kitchen hearth, in the hollow of a cold pit, in the mundane objects that time chose not to discard. So next time you think of Shakespeare, don't picture the quill first. Picture the flame, the flicker of morning light on a kitchen wall, the quiet scrape of a spoon in a wooden bowl, the smell of bread, the hush before speech. The real poetry was always here. And though the house itself is gone, reduced to outlines and ghostly floor plans, this space remains sacred, not in a religious sense, but in a human one. It's a reminder that even the greatest minds have cold feet in winter, that even legends need a place to warm their hands. In the end, the story of Shakespeare's kitchen isn't just about him, it's about all of us. About how history is not built in grand events alone, but in the echo of footsteps on worn stone, in the rhythm of daily chores, and in the silent poetry of rooms now empty, but never forgotten. A castle without a hill, the fortress that faced every siege. It doesn't look like much from a distance. A flat land stretches out in every direction, quiet, dry, and unbothered by the centuries. There are no cliffs, no towering rocks, no mountain ledge to hold the wind. Yet in the middle of this level ground, a fortress rises, still, immovable, waiting. Most castles, throughout history, were built for advantage. The higher the hill, the better the view. The steeper the incline, the safer the walls. But here, in this part of southern Spain, a fortress was built where no one dared to build one. No elevation, no river, just the earth and time. This is the fortress of La Calahorra, and it holds more than stone. It holds every scar of war, every echo of Moorish chants and Spanish prayers, every whisper of siege and surrender. And somewhere inside, it holds a story. Not one told with drama or fanfare, but with calm, tired walls, with staircases worn down by dusty boots, with windows that no longer close, and doors that haven't locked in 300 years. The story begins in layers. 3 of them, because this isn't just one fortress, it's 3 castles, stacked into one. The first was Moorish. Long before the Spanish flag ever touched these lands, the Moors, Muslim architects from North Africa, settled here. They built a square fortress with modest towers, meant not to intimidate, but to last. It was simple: earth walls, brick foundations, a courtyard open to the sky. It didn't shimmer, it didn't shine, but it endured. Even as winds changed and borders shifted. The second came later, a Christian fortress, added atop the Moorish shell. This one was defensive, assertive, made of thick Spanish brick, the kind that turned reddish-brown under the sun. New towers were added, a chapel, a lookout post, a place for bells, though no one remembers if they ever rang. By the time the third layer arrived, the fortress had already seen too much. This final version was a Renaissance dream: elegant, softer edges, columns, arches, a beautiful inner courtyard, designed not for war but for poetry, dance, and perhaps even love. But here's the strange part: even in peace, the fortress was never left alone. It was attacked, again, and again, and again, by rival kingdoms, by renegade lords, by forgotten armies whose names no longer appear in books. It withstood cannonballs that left no mark, sieges that stretched for months, then faded like breath on glass, fires that scorched the doors but spared the stone. The land never offered protection, but the fortress, somehow, never fell. Locals tell stories. They say the fortress has a soul, that each of the 3 layers speaks to a different part of the past. They say the walls remember, not just events, but emotions, that you can feel fear in the first layer, pride in the second, and quiet longing in the third. There are places within the fortress where sound behaves strangely, rooms where your voice echoes 3 times, as if each layer answers you, one by one. Whispers bounce in uneven rhythms, footsteps echo even when you're barefoot, and in the kitchen, cold air still lingers near the hearth, even in summer. Some say it's just physics, others say it's memory. The fortress has no grand moat, no drawbridge, no towering peak to pierce the sky, but it doesn't need them. Because it's not just defending land, it's defending time. It holds onto the past so tightly, it forgets to let go. There's a window in the upper chamber, a narrow slit in the wall that once watched the horizon. It's sealed now, but if you stand beside it, you can still feel wind, as if the fortress remembers what it was like to see beyond its walls. In the chapel, there's a cracked floor tile that doesn't quite match the rest. No one knows who replaced it. No one knows what lies beneath. But every caretaker who has worked here says the same thing: don't move it. Not because it's cursed, Not because of superstition, but because that one mismatched tile feels like the fortress trying to heal itself. A single patch in a wound that never closed. There are no official records of the final siege, no detailed account, but a carving was found, hidden behind the wall of a servant's room. It's faint, scratched by hand. 3 words in Spanish, no nos rendimos, we did not surrender. And they didn't. Today the fortress is quiet. Tourists come and go. Sometimes a historian visits with notebooks and maps, but mostly it's alone, still, warm in some places, cold in others, and always, watching. A castle without a hill. A story without a single narrator. A structure that never asked to be remembered, but was. And if you listen, very softly, you might hear it speak. Not with words, but with the hush of stone warming in sunlight. With the creak of a wooden beam too old to fall. With the weight of silence built brick by brick. Because sometimes, the strongest fortresses are the ones that were never meant to survive, but did. The secret inside the scabbard. It was tucked away in the corner of a forgotten vault. Dusty, unmarked and silent. At first glance it looked like any old saber. Curved, elegant, dulled by time. The blade bore the quiet signs of history. Tiny nicks along its edge. Blackened marks that hinted at fire, and the leather grip worn smooth from countless palms. But the scabbard held the secret. It came to light in a museum basement in Prague. A curator, cataloging objects marked miscellaneous, pulled it from a crate that hadn't been opened in decades. There were no notes, no provenance, only a rusted metal tag and a flicker of curiosity. The saber slid free with a whisper, and when it did, something strange happened. A soft clink, metal on metal, a sound that shouldn't have been there. They shook the scabbard gently, again, a faint metallic knock. X-rays confirmed it. Inside the scabbard, sealed behind layers of wood and brass, was a single gold coin, pressed thin, wedged flat, hidden deliberately. But why? And more than that, who would hide a coin inside the very place meant to house a blade? That mystery drew in the experts, and with it came a second discovery. The saber wasn't ordinary at all. It was a weapon made across empires. Its hilt, Ottoman, its blade, Austrian, and its markings, unmistakably Russian. 3 worlds woven into one instrument of war, and somehow, someone thought to seal a coin within it, as if it held a prayer, or a curse, or something older still. The scabbard was dismantled with great care, not by force, but layer by layer, through heat and time, and at the very center, embedded between 2 thin ribs of ash wood, they found it, the coin, gold, about the size of a thumbprint, not minted by any bank, not carrying any royal head. Instead it bore a worn emblem, a 3-headed eagle, surrounded by 13 tiny stars. No nation had ever used that exact symbol, and that made things strange. Scholars speculated. Some believed it was a keepsake, a token hidden by a soldier for luck. Others whispered of smugglers who used sword scabbards to hide currency while crossing borders. But that wouldn't explain the symbol. It wouldn't explain the blend of cultures in the saber itself, or why the coin was made of solid gold in the first place. The blade was traced, not by documents, but by style, metalwork and wear. It had likely passed through at least 4 hands, a gift, perhaps, or a spoil of war. The Ottoman Guard was 17th century. The blade bore Austrian metallurgy from the mid-1600s, and the etching, tiny Cyrillic letters in silver, hinted at a Russian noble, perhaps even a Cossack leader. But the blade wasn't just assembled, it was fused. Each part fit the other like it was always meant to be. One expert called it a sword that tells its own migration. Another said it was like holding 3 stories at once, and still, the coin remained the most perplexing part. Gold doesn't rust, it doesn't decay, and yet this coin was pitted, scarred, as though it had traveled, hidden, for centuries. Stories began to take shape, not confirmed, but imagined. One tale told of a young soldier sent across Europe as empires collided. He had nothing but a blade he built from pieces scavenged in war. He tucked a coin inside, not for value, but to remember someone he left behind. A lover, a child, a mother. Another theory went darker. The coin was a seal, part of a deal struck in blood, and the saber was forged in betrayal, a weapon that could not be separated from its curse. Some believed the coin was payment, not to a human, but to something else. A token offered to death, a bribe to pass by for just one more day. The scabbard's wood, when carbon dated, traced back to trees felled near the Danube. Around 1645, that fit the time window. That matched the stories, but it didn't solve anything, because then came the strangest discovery. When researchers placed the coin under ultraviolet light, they noticed something faint, almost invisible, a set of symbols, etched only lightly, only seen in blue glow. 13 marks, laid in a circle. None of them matched known alphabets. Not Cyrillic, not Latin, not Greek, not even ancient scripts like Aramaic or Phoenician. The pattern, repeating like a clock, seemed more magical than linguistic. A code? a ritual no one knew, and perhaps no one ever will. The saber is now housed in a secure glass case, not for its blade, not for its hilt, but for the scabbard, for the gold sealed within, and for the silence that surrounds it. Museum staff report something strange, not eerie, but still. When visitors stand in front of it, many go quiet, some linger, a few even cry. They don't know why. Maybe it's the blade's long journey. Maybe it's the hidden coin, pressed close to a warrior's side. Or maybe, just maybe, the saber carries the hum of 3 empires, 3 hearts, and 1 story never meant to be told. In the end, it's just a weapon. A curved piece of metal once meant to kill, but inside it, sealed behind time, and wood, and silence, is a coin that asks a question no one can answer. Why was it there? Why was it hidden? And what message did it carry across a continent, and into our hands? Some objects don't shout, they whisper. This saber is one of them. A whisper across borders, a secret carried in gold, a story we were never meant to find, but did. And now, it waits in quiet glass, its blade dulled, its voice soft, still holding the memory of a coin and the empires it passed through. The golden tickets to the pagan temple. They weren't coins, not really. And they weren't statues either, too small to pray to, too strange to spend, but someone long ago made them carefully. Tiny pairs of gold figures, just an inch tall, etched with details almost invisible to the eye, and they left them behind, not randomly, not carelessly, but with purpose. That much is certain. What's uncertain is why. The story begins in a field that wasn't supposed to hold anything at all. The hillside in northern Greece had been plowed and grazed for years. Olive trees, goats, tourists passing through on dusty roads. But a team of archaeologists came anyway, drawn not by clues in the earth but by words in a forgotten book. A monk, centuries earlier, had written about a temple lost to time. He described twin pillars, a sloping path, and something strange, offerings, he said, that glittered even in the dark. Tiny, twin-shaped idols, always in pairs, always in gold. That was all they had. Most laughed it off, a myth at best, a mistake at worst. But the team came anyway, armed with ground-penetrating radar and stubborn curiosity. And within the first few days of digging, they struck something hard. A stairway, just the corner, just a few steps carved into stone, but enough. They cleared further, removing layer after layer of wind-blown soil and forgotten time. What emerged was not a full temple, not a grand structure with soaring columns or bronze doors, but instead, a chamber. Low, rectangular, quiet, not meant to be seen from a distance, not meant to impress. Inside, at the center was a stone altar, simple, weathered, unmoving, and scattered around it, nearly 100 of the tiny golden figures, some tucked into niches in the walls, others buried in small pits, always in pairs, a man and a woman, a figure standing and one kneeling. Some held bowls, others held nothing at all, but each one glowed faintly, still holding the warmth of the hands that placed them there. Were they gods? No records of this specific pair exist in any known mythology, no matching names, no temple descriptions, no cults or rituals, but still, they had meaning. Some theorized they represented worshippers themselves, ordinary people, offering a tiny golden likeness of themselves in devotion, a way to be present at the altar forever, a wish for something permanent in a world that changes too fast. Others thought they were guardians, not of treasure, but of memory, placed to mark a union, a birth, a loss. One of the most striking things, none were signed, no names, no inscriptions, only silence. But then came a discovery. Beneath one of the altar stones, a small cavity. Inside it, the oldest of the figurines, cruder, less polished, but still gold. And between the 2 tiny figures, a third, a child, held in both their hands, no older than a grain of rice in size, but unmistakable. Was this a family shrine? Were the offerings not to gods but to ancestors? Was the temple not a place of worship, but a place of remembering? Some think the site was used only for a generation or two. Its construction style didn't match others in the region. Its materials came from 200 kilometers away, brought by hand, not by trade, which means someone, maybe a small group, a family, or a sect, went to great lengths to build something for themselves, and no one else. They left no writings, no signs on roads, no grave markers, just these pairs, gold figures, tiny gestures, each one crafted with care, then tucked away where no one was supposed to find them. But time erases intentions, and centuries later, their privacy was undone. The golden figures are now housed in a museum in Thessaloniki, behind glass, labeled with tags that say unclassified ritual object, a quiet name for something so strange. Children press their faces to the glass, trying to guess what the figures are doing. Are they dancing? Are they offering? Are they saying goodbye? Some seem joyful, some mournful, some are hard to interpret at all, but all of them feel intimate, like holding someone's diary you were never meant to read. No one knows who buried them, no one knows who built the altar, and yet, standing in that small museum room, you feel them. You feel the warmth of purpose, long after the names have faded. One archaeologist described the feeling best. "It's like someone left a gold whisper in the earth," she said, "and we're only just starting to listen." And that might be the truth of it. These figures were never meant to speak loudly. They were not carved to declare or demand. They were made to sit in quiet places near stone, near earth, near memories. They were made to wait. So now we ask, were they tickets to a sacred place? Were they the price of memory, a currency for silence? Or were they simply love, poured into metal and left behind like a soft goodbye? We may never know, and maybe that's all right. Some things, especially the precious ones, are meant to stay partly unknown, not because they are forgotten, but because they were always private, always sacred, always gold. The tunnel that carried Rome through the marsh. It's easy to forget just how much of the ancient world was shaped not by kings, or armies, or even gods, but by the land itself. Before conquest, before glory, and before empire, came mud. Thick, clinging marshland once spread across the low valleys of Latium. In these murky places, the water had no will to leave. It just sat, damp, stagnant, stubborn, smothering the earth in silence. And yet, Rome would not be Rome without these wetlands. It is here, in the quietest corner of ancient Italy, that something extraordinary was dug, not into history books but into stone. Today, just outside the modern town of Aricia, there lies a dark tunnel cut through volcanic tuff, long, narrow, curved like a whispering serpent beneath the hills. It is called the Emissarium of Albano, and it may be one of the oldest feats of civil engineering ever constructed on the Italian peninsula. But the story of this tunnel isn't just about stone, it's about ancient patience, about unseen hands, about the echo of bare feet on damp floors, long after the people are gone. Let's go there. Let's stand where the marshes once ruled. Let's step into the tunnel that Rome carved through the mud. The year is somewhere around 398 BCE. Rome, as we think of it today, doesn't quite exist yet. It's still a city of brick and blood, still finding its shape among a dozen rival tribes. But even now, the Romans are building. Even now, they're digging. And just to the southeast, nestled in a crater left behind by ancient eruptions, lies Lake Albano. It's not just a lake, it's a lake with a temper. During heavy rains, it overflows, and when it overflows, it floods the sacred groves of the gods. The marshes at the bottom of the crater swell with dirty water, breeding mosquitoes and ruin. To the Romans, this is more than inconvenient, it's offensive. This is the land of temples, they believe. The land where the gods of Latium walked. And now their footprints are drowning in bog water. They need a solution. But remember, this is the 4th century BCE. No drills, no pumps, no modern hydraulics, just stone, just willpower, just an understanding of slope and soil and silence. So what did they do? They made a hole in the mountain. The Emissarium was no small undertaking. It stretched over a kilometer in length, cut straight through solid volcanic rock. The goal was deceptively simple: drain the lake's excess water during storms, and carry it through the crater wall, releasing it into the countryside beyond. That way the lake would remain sacred, the marshes would dry, and the gods, hopefully, would stop punishing the land. But this wasn't just a ditch. It was a precisely angled tunnel, dug by hand, by torchlight, over years. Picture the scene: men with bronze chisels, tapping and scraping by the glow of flickering oil lamps, the air close, the stone damp, each sound echoing a dozen times down the narrow channel. They weren't just workers, they were whisperers to the earth, feeling the slope with their bodies, listening for the tone of the rock. It's said that they began digging from both ends, one team starting at the lakeside, the other from the open countryside. And somehow, when they met in the middle, the two tunnels aligned almost perfectly. A miracle of Roman precision, or maybe just a result of sleepless nights, countless calculations, and a refusal to let nature win. The first water to run through the Emissarium must have felt like a prayer answered. The marshes receded, the temples dried, the sacred grove at the base of the crater, believed to be the dwelling place of the goddess Diana, stood once again on solid ground. People brought offerings, they sang, they believed that order had been restored. But the tunnel didn't just carry water, it carried memory, and over the centuries, it became something more than a drain. It became a story buried underground. When the engineers of Napoleon's army rediscovered the Emissarium in the 19th century, they were stunned. Some even refused to believe it was Roman. Too precise, they said, too clean. But it was Roman, and it was old. Older than the Colosseum, older than the Forum as we know it, older than the Roman Empire itself. It had been hiding all this time, beneath grass and ash and vines, just waiting, just listening. Even today, parts of the tunnel are walkable. If you enter from the lake's edge, you'll feel the air change. It cools, it quiets. The sound of your footsteps becomes the only voice. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence, and in that silence, something happens. You begin to feel it. Not fear, not awe, but familiarity. As if the tunnel remembers. As if, somehow, it recognizes another set of footsteps. There are theories, of course. Some say the tunnel was used during wars, to move troops undetected. Others say it was symbolic, part of a ritual purification ceremony held during sacred festivals. A few even claim that it wasn't built by the Romans at all, but by the Etruscans, those mysterious neighbors of early Rome who vanished, leaving only their tombs behind. We may never know the full truth, but here's what we do know. In a time when most cities built walls, Rome dug a tunnel. When others feared the marsh, Rome embraced it, and when the gods seemed silent, Rome listened to the earth instead. It's strange how something so practical can feel so poetic, but that's the magic of the emissarium. It's not grand, it doesn't boast, it simply is. Like the heartbeat of a forgotten machine, still ticking under layers of soil. Sometimes, when it rains in the Alban Hills, the water finds its way into the old tunnel once more. It flows through the same channel, it echoes off the same walls, and for a moment, just a moment, time folds, the past speaks, and Rome, in all her dusty dreamlike glory, opens one eye. The warrior who carried the Ormside bowl. A looted Anglo-Saxon masterpiece, buried with a man who may not have known its worth. The wind moved gently over the quiet field. Grass swayed like an old memory. There were no ruins, no crumbling walls, no towers to hint that something ancient slept beneath the soil. Just silence, soft and simple. Yet under that still earth, tucked beside the remains of a warrior long gone, lay something strange, something precious. They found him by accident, a burial, shallow but careful, in Cumbria, England, the kind of burial that doesn't call for attention. No grand markings, no banners, just a grave. The body had been buried facing east, arms crossed over the chest, one hand still close to where a sword might have once rested. Time had stolen the weapon, but something else remained, something it shouldn't have. Wrapped beside him, cushioned in earth, lay a bowl. Not a simple bowl, not one carved in a hurry or made for daily meals. No, this bowl was different. Its edges were flared like petals, its base curved and balanced. Its decoration, pure Anglo-Saxon goldwork, interlacing beasts and winding vines, filled with purpose, glowing with meaning. Its name would later be whispered through museums and books, the Ormside Bowl. But what was this masterpiece doing here, in a grave so unassuming, with a man history had forgotten? The Ormside Bowl should not have been his. That's the mystery, that's the quiet strangeness. It had been crafted, historians say, in the early 8th century, at a time when craftsmanship was sacred. When a bowl was not just a vessel but a symbol, a gift, a treasure. It was made of silver and richly gilded in gold, with two distinct layers, an outer silver shell and an inner copper-gilt liner. Between the layers, it held silence and secrets, and yet it was not buried with a king or a bishop, not with a scribe or a noble, but with a man whose name has never been recovered, a soldier maybe, or perhaps a thief. His bones spoke of strength. He had been broad-shouldered, his wrists thick, his arms used to labor. This was someone who had lived by the sword, lived perhaps during times when Viking raids struck like lightning, and border wars whispered through the hills. So who was he? A guardian? A looter? A man of purpose? Or just someone who stumbled into history because of what he happened to carry when he died? Let's picture him, just for a moment. A man wrapped in rough wool, cloak pinned at the shoulder with something simple, iron, not gold. A man who'd walked the northern roads alone, or maybe in a band of others. He may have carried the bowl wrapped in cloth, or perhaps it had been stolen, clutched in a raid, wrested from some holy site in the night, while candles burned low and monks hid behind heavy doors. Or maybe he didn't steal it at all. Maybe he was given it. Maybe once he saved someone, a child, a priest, a noble, and was gifted the bowl in thanks. A reward too grand for someone like him. And maybe he kept it not as a possession, but as a talisman, a mystery he could hold, though he never truly understood it. We can't know, and that's what makes it echo. The bowl itself speaks a different language. It tells stories in curves and etchings. On its surface, small creatures twist, dragons, birds, forms from myth. They loop and knot, in endless patterns. They stare back at you, not with malice, but with timelessness. This wasn't something someone made in a week. It was forged with thought, shaped with steady hands, hammered in halls that echoed with prayers and politics. It was not a bowl to eat from. It was a bowl to place on altars, a bowl for ritual, maybe even ceremony. And yet in the Ormside burial, it had no altar. It had a grave. When archaeologists lifted the bowl from the soil, it was intact. The soil had wrapped around it like a protective shell. And yet the questions poured in faster than the dirt could be brushed away. Why was it buried with him? Had he known what he carried? Had someone else buried it with him on purpose to honor him, or to hide it forever? Had it been cursed? Had it been sacred? Had it been a mistake? These are the questions that still flicker like candlelight in the minds of historians. And there's another detail, easy to miss, but heavy with meaning. The bowl's base had signs of wear, tiny dents, scratches, almost invisible, unless the light hit them just right. That meant it had been used. It hadn't been locked away in some monastery chest, untouched for centuries. It had passed from hand to hand, and each of those hands might have told a different story. So let's imagine them, together, all the hands that touched the Ormside bowl. First, the maker, bent over his bench, hammer in hand, light from a fire bouncing off the curve of silver. Then the giver, perhaps a king or a bishop, who passed it on to a chapel or to a warrior of trust. Then the keeper, who watched over it in silence, letting no dust settle on it, polishing it with cloths dipped in oil and reverence. Then the thief, perhaps, who broke the silence and ran. And then, the man in the grave, the warrior, maybe tired, maybe wounded, maybe just carrying it for someone else, or maybe believing, quietly, that it would protect him even in death. The ground around the grave offered no other answers. No grave goods, no inscriptions, just soil and silence. It felt as if the bowl had been buried in haste, or maybe in love. That's another possibility, isn't it? That someone cared for the man, that someone, in their grief, placed the most valuable thing they had beside him, not to honor what he did, but to honor what he meant. Sometimes the most precious things aren't buried with kings, but with those who mattered to someone. Years later, the Ormside bowl rests in a museum, cleaned, protected, lit behind glass. Visitors pass by. Some pause, some don't. But what they see is only the bowl. What they don't see is the man, the unnamed warrior who once held it, who once lay beneath a field of grass with the weight of a forgotten treasure by his side, a treasure that never belonged to him, and yet became part of his story forever. And maybe that's the quiet beauty of this tale, that history doesn't always belong to kings, that some legacies are accidental, that sometimes the past hides not in the loudest halls but in the silent graves of the unknown, and that a man with no name, carrying a bowl he may never have understood, can still echo across centuries, through silver, soil, and the stories we choose to tell. Let the grass sway, let the wind move slow, and let the Ormside bowl rest where it once lay, in the hands of a mystery, in the arms of a forgotten soul, who carried something far more valuable than he may have ever known. The treasure with no owner, the Malmesbury hoard, beneath a gentle hill in Wiltshire where the grass grows in lazy waves, and the wind carries the scent of soil turned by centuries. A discovery was made, quiet, unannounced, like a whisper between the earth and the one who touched it. No grand monument, no carved marker, just the weight of metal tucked under layers of forgotten time. 1,200 Roman coins, buried together as if they shared a secret. They called it the Malmesbury hoard, a treasure. Yes, but not in the way of crowns or gemstones. This was a different kind of treasure, one that didn't sparkle, but hummed, not loud, but constant. The sound of lives past, of hands that once traded bread and olives, of voices that argued over taxes, of merchants, soldiers, perhaps farmers, now silent, yet still here. No name was left with the hoard, no written explanation, no stone plaque to explain why these coins were gathered, who held them last, or why they were never retrieved. But that's where stories begin, not in what is known, but in what isn't. Each of the 1,200 coins bore the face of an emperor, not just one, but many. Some were minted under the rule of Claudius, others bore the image of Constantine the Great. A span of nearly 100 years stretched across these faces, like a photograph slowly developed over time. It wasn't just a purse spilled on the way home. This was something curated, gathered carefully, and stored, intentionally. But for what? Let's begin at the edge of the Roman Empire. Britannia, a land that Rome struggled to tame, cold, rain-soaked, rebellious, and yet rich in grain, tin, wool. It was worth the trouble. Roman roads stitched the land like a quilt, villas rose, towns were mapped, and coins, Roman coins, flowed like water from town to town, hand to hand. Coins weren't just money, they were messengers, propaganda in copper and silver. If you lived in a far-flung corner of the empire and never saw the emperor's face in person, you saw it on the coin in your hand. You read his name. You believed he ruled the world, because his face was pressed into the metal you used to buy your bread. So when someone in Malmesbury began gathering coins, they were gathering more than money. They were collecting power, identity, the echo of empire. The hoard was discovered in 2012, beneath a field that gave no hint of what lay below. A casual walk, a glint of something unnatural in the soil, and the slow, steady brush of a trowel uncovered the first disc of history. Then another, then 10, then dozens. They were packed tightly, as if arranged with purpose, bundled together with care. No bag remained. No box survived. But the shape was deliberate. Coins pressed shoulder to shoulder, like a garrison in formation, holding a line across time. And here's what makes the Malmesbury hoard truly strange. These coins span decades. That's not unusual on its own, but this hoard didn't seem to be from a single chaotic moment, like a farmer hiding his savings during a revolt. It wasn't a sudden burial. It was layered, accumulated. A slow-growing deposit, as if someone had been adding to it, maybe over years. Imagine a small family estate. A man and his son, perhaps the father served in the Roman auxiliary, earned pay from the front lines of Hadrian's Wall. He returns, and rather than spend it all, he hides a portion. Then the son adds to it. Over time it becomes a family habit. Not out of greed, but security. Maybe pride. And then silence. One day no one comes back to add more. Perhaps they moved away. Perhaps they died suddenly, leaving no one who knew about the hoard. Or perhaps something darker. The empire was crumbling. Rome pulled its soldiers out of Britain in the early 400s. The roads decayed. Towns were abandoned. Raiders came. The world changed. The coinage changed too. And so the treasure remained. Not lost, just left behind. Every coin has its own story. And when examined under the microscope, you can see faint grooves, nicks from wear, smudges from sweat, even the remains of oil rubbed in to preserve the shine. These weren't display pieces. They were used, lived in, like old boots. One coin bears the image of Emperor Magnentius, a usurper who ruled for just 2 years. His short reign ended in civil war. His coins were pulled from circulation by those who followed him. To have one in the hoard means it was buried by someone who lived through that upheaval, or knew of it. There's another, nearly pristine, from Constantius II. The details still crisp, laurels in his hair. His gaze sharp. Perhaps this coin was part of a soldier's pay, or a tax collector's collection. We'll never know. But here's something quietly haunting. Some of the coins had been pierced. A clean hole through the top, as if to string them. Not for theft, but for display. Perhaps worn as pendants, or sewn onto clothing, or used in ritual. And that changes the story again. Now we're not just talking about currency. We're talking about meaning, belief, superstition. Someone may have viewed these coins not as tools of commerce, but as protective charms, symbols, maybe even prayers. After the hoard was uncovered, experts examined the soil layers surrounding it. There was no sign of a building nearby, no remains of a road, just open earth. That made it more peculiar. Why hide something so valuable in the middle of nowhere? Unless it was a secret known only to one. A person can hide many things: emotions, doubts, wealth, but when you bury something, you leave behind a pact. You're trusting that you'll return, and if you don't, you're trusting the earth to guard it, and the earth did. For over 1,600 years. Today, the Malmesbury hoard is preserved, studied, and displayed, but its owner remains anonymous. No name on record, no initials carved into stone, just silence. And yet in that silence, something speaks. It tells us that people cared about the future, that they planned, that they feared, that they cherished the metal shaped by their empire, that they worried about loss, that they believed in return. There's a beauty in that, an entire lifetime hidden in a jar or a cloth, buried under the same sky we walk today. Some say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it's written by those who quietly stepped away, who buried their wealth and never said why. And in that mystery we find the human, not just coins, but hopes, fears, secrets, still resting beneath the soil of Wiltshire. The crown only 7 people can unlock. In the quiet shadows of Prague Castle, behind thick stone walls that have withstood centuries of war, weather, and whispers, there lies a room, small, plain, almost underwhelming, until you realize what it guards. In this room, resting beneath layers of cloth, security, and reverence, lies a crown. But not just any crown. It is the crown of Saint Wenceslaus, a relic so sacred, so storied, that only 7 people in the entire nation of the Czech Republic hold the keys to open its chamber. Not 1 key, not 2, but 7. Each one held by a different official. None of them can enter alone, and none have ever seen the crown by simply asking. To even approach it, all 7 must agree. All 7 must gather, and all 7 must turn their keys together. Why so many locks? Why so many layers of secrecy? The answer lies not just in the crown itself, but in the strange, unspoken power it's believed to hold. Because this isn't just a crown of gold, it's a crown of stories, a crown of silence, a crown with a curse. Let's sit with it, together, slowly, sleepily, gently drifting through the mystery. It's a strange thing to imagine, a room with 7 locks, waiting for 7 keys, held by 7 hands. It feels like something from a fairy tale, but the crown of Saint Wenceslaus is real. Its jewels have shimmered in candlelight, its gold has warmed under human touch. And yet, it hasn't been worn in generations. Not truly. Not since the 1830s. You see, this crown wasn't made for everyday kingship. It was created as a symbol, a treasure to be used only for coronations, then locked away again. Its purpose was never power. It was presence. Made in 1346 by order of Charles IV, the King of Bohemia and future Holy Roman Emperor. The crown is studded with 19 sapphires, 44 spinels, 20 emeralds, and a single ruby. A ruby so deep in hue that it's said to have once drawn blood from the finger of a careless priest. Whether that's myth or memory, no one knows, but that ruby, perched right at the front, has always been the most watched and the most feared. You see, there's a legend, one that generations have quietly passed from mouth to ear, never written, always known. The legend says that if anyone unworthy dares to wear the crown of Saint Wenceslas, if any person dares place it on their head for selfish reasons, then they will die within the year. Not by fire, not by blade, but by fate, and the legend has history behind it. During World War II, when Nazi forces occupied Czechoslovakia, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most feared SS leaders, reportedly broke into the locked chamber, without permission, without the keys. He had the door forced open and placed the crown on his head. Some say it was for a photo. Others say it was simply to declare dominance. But less than a year later, Heydrich was dead, killed by resistance fighters in an ambush that remains one of the most daring in all of European history. Coincidence, perhaps, but the Czech people remembered, and the keys became even more sacred. The 7 key holders are carefully chosen, always a mix: religious leaders, government officials, and scholars. Each key is different. Each one fits a specific lock. The keys are never stored in the same place, and when the crown is moved or revealed, all 7 must be present. Even then, it is only seen for a few days at a time. Then it disappears again, into the silence, and with it go the whispers. Who made the original lock design? Who decided it must be 7? Why not 6 or 8? Some believe the number 7 carries meaning beyond politics, that it ties to old Bohemian mysticism. 7 days, 7 seals, 7 trials. Perhaps the crown is not just royal, but ritual. Others say it's protection, not from theft, but from the crown itself. Because the crown of Saint Wenceslas has not only never been stolen, it's never been faked. No replicas, no forgeries, no failed heists, not even attempts. Almost like something is watching over it. Even though the chamber is unassuming, the air inside is different, cooler, still, almost reverent. The crown rests under glass, its base gently cushioned by velvet. But people don't speak around it, not loudly, and no one touches it. Even those allowed to be in the room during its rare showings tend to keep their distance. There is no proof of a curse, but also, no doubt, and here's what makes the mystery deeper. There are no official written records of the crown's supposed powers, nothing in the government, nothing in the church, and yet every key holder knows the story, every single one, as if it was breathed into the room itself. Over time, the ritual of unlocking the chamber has become a ceremony all its own. Silent nods, steady hands, each key placed carefully into its lock, each turned, slowly, with purpose. The final click always sounds louder than expected, and for a moment, when the door opens, there is always stillness, a kind of pause, as if the crown is deciding whether it's ready to be seen. Visitors who viewed it say it doesn't just sparkle, it hums, not audibly, but emotionally. It feels like standing in front of something old enough to remember things the world has forgotten. Wars, betrayals, oaths, coronations, and somewhere in that shimmering silence, people wonder, who made this crown, truly, and what did they hide inside it? A few scholars have noted that the gold in the band comes from a particular region of Bohemia once ruled by a mysterious order of monks. The sapphires are unusually cut, not in typical medieval fashion. And the ruby is unlike any seen in other European regalia. There's even a rumor that the ruby came from the east, possibly carried on a trade route older than the crown itself, or gifted by someone who never intended it to be worn. And then there's the saint himself, Wenceslas, a Bohemian duke who was murdered by his own brother in 935 AD. His legend grew after his death, and he became a symbol of righteous rule, not a conqueror, not a tyrant, but a just leader. The crown was made in his name, but some wonder, was it made for him, or by him? A few strange carvings beneath the crown's inner lining hint at symbols associated with early Christian mysticism. One tiny mark, hidden beneath the sapphire at the back, resembles a charm used in old protection rites. It's almost as if the crown wasn't just designed to be worn but to ward off, to contain, to seal something in. Could it be that the crown was never cursed, but rather, the curse is what it holds back? The last time the crown was seen in public was during a national celebration. 7 key holders arrived. 7 locks turned, and for 3 days the chamber was open. Lines stretched outside the castle, but inside, no one spoke above a whisper. Even children went silent, as if they felt something they couldn't explain, and when the chamber was closed again, the silence lingered. Not fear, not awe, just quiet. The kind of quiet you feel in places where history breathes. So if one day you find yourself walking the cobbled paths of Prague Castle, and you come across a heavy door sealed with 7 locks, you'll know what rests behind it. A crown that hasn't been worn in nearly 2 centuries, a relic that needs 7 people to be seen, and a story, still unfinished, still humming, still watching, just waiting for the right moment to be unlocked again. Beneath the fields of Gutland, silver from the sands. Beneath a stretch of quiet farmland in Luxembourg, in a place known as Gutland, the land rolled gently like it had done for centuries. At first glance it was nothing remarkable, just a simple field, tucked behind a small rural house, with a weathered outhouse squatting near the edge of the property. The kind of place that might get muddy when it rains, or bloom with yellow weeds in spring. But the earth beneath this spot was holding onto a story, a long-forgotten one, and it waited, without a sound, until the right hands came along to disturb it. It began not with archaeologists, but with a farmer. He was doing what many have done before him, clearing some space, maybe thinking about repairs. And then came the metal clang, the sound that told him his shovel had found something more than soil. It wasn't just a rock. It had a tone, solid, echoing, and it didn't move like stone does. When he brushed away the earth, his breath caught. There, under the edge of the outhouse foundation, was a bundle of fabric-wrapped metal, tightly packed, neatly buried, almost like someone had tucked it there on purpose, hundreds of years ago, and simply vanished. The farmer called in the local heritage office. He didn't touch it beyond what was necessary, and when the archaeologists arrived, they realized immediately, this wasn't junk, it was silver, coins, a hoard, as they'd later call it. Over 90 of them at first, then more, stacked, pressed, protected by the cool dark of the earth. And it wasn't just the quantity that stunned them, it was the variety. These weren't coins minted all in one place, or even in one time period. They came from all across the Viking trading routes, from Anglo-Saxon England, from the Holy Roman Empire, from regions far up in the north, and down into the Slavic world. Some were chipped, some had been clipped to test their weight. Others still bore the sharp stamped faces of kings and emperors, their names almost legible after centuries underground. But there was one coin, one tiny disc of silver, that would rewrite a piece of history. It was thinner than the rest, delicately inscribed, and it bore a name that shouldn't have been there. This coin, minted in the mid-11th century, carried a name long thought to have disappeared from the Viking world, Harthacnut, a short-reigned king whose memory had nearly been lost. Historians had argued about him for years. Some claimed his rule never extended into certain parts of Europe. Others said he was merely a footnote, a temporary figure between stronger kings. But here was a silver coin, found not in a royal treasury, but under an outhouse in rural Luxembourg, bearing his name and title, proof that his influence had reached farther than previously believed. And just like that, the field in Gutland was no longer just a field, it was a map. But let's pause here, take a slow breath, because this isn't just a story about silver. It's about the people who carried it, the hands that buried it, the stories we'll never fully know. The archaeologists began their careful work. Over the next weeks, the area was excavated with brushes, not shovels. Soil samples were taken, pollen tested. Even the layout of the outhouse was recorded in meticulous detail. Because everything mattered now. Every root that had twisted through the coins, every insect burrow, every piece of broken pottery nearby. They called it the Mamer Hoard, named after the region of Gutland where it was found. And as they catalogued it, something strange became clear. This wasn't a random dumping ground. The coins had been wrapped tightly in linen, knotted in a way that resembled seafaring bundles. The knots weren't local. They matched a pattern known from Scandinavian trading ships, quick-release hitches that could be untied with a single tug, useful for merchants or for thieves in a hurry. That single detail changed the tone of the investigation. Who buried this treasure, and why? The site had no signs of violence, no bones, no burnt wood, no grave goods nearby, just coins and silence. One theory emerged. A trader, traveling through what is now Luxembourg, had used the area as a stopover point. Perhaps he had grown ill, or perhaps he was hiding from someone. He might have buried his wealth, thinking he'd return for it. He never did. Another theory suggested war. The region had seen conflict in the early medieval period. Maybe this was tribute payment hidden before an invasion. Maybe it was a local lord's emergency reserve. But my favorite theory, the one that feels most human, most sad, is this. It belonged to someone who didn't think of it as treasure. Someone who carried it not for its monetary worth, but for what it represented. Travel. trade, a life across oceans, maybe even memories of people now long gone. And then something happened, an accident, an ambush, a betrayal, and the silver was left behind. The linen knot held for centuries, the earth pressed in around it, and the field went quiet. Let's sit with that for a moment. Imagine standing above that patch of soil 1,000 years ago, the wind bending the tall grass, the smell of a wood fire from a nearby farmhouse. Maybe the person who buried the hoard had a meal here. Maybe they looked around once, memorizing the trees, the curve of the hill, so they could find the spot again. Maybe they walked away with a heavy heart. And now, centuries later, a coin bearing the name of a forgotten king breaks through the silence. That's what archaeology does. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It peels back the soft layers of time and asks us to feel something. The Mamer hoard is now preserved. The coins have been cleaned, photographed, studied. Some are in museums, others still being tested for their metal content, their origins. But none belonged to anyone in living memory. They had no heirs, no wills, no signatures. They were waiting. Sometimes, when archaeologists find treasure, the focus is on gold, on glitter, on value. But this story, this one is different. It's not about the shine, it's about the stillness. The way a forgotten field became a messenger. The way a single coin gave back a lost chapter of a king's reign. And the way someone, 1,000 years ago, trusted the earth to hold something precious. They were right. It did. The saber that belonged to no one and everyone. It was found wrapped in linen, old, threadbare and weathered by time. The fabric had darkened, as if it had absorbed the dreams of many hands, and the metal it concealed was no ordinary sword. It shimmered faintly beneath the dust, not polished but preserved. And even before it was fully unwrapped, there was a sense that this weapon had traveled farther than most ever do. The hilt was unmistakably Indian, carved with floral designs. It curled like a peacock's plume, ornate and proud. The guard, though, whispered a different story. Its curves resembled the sabers of Persia, sharp and elegant, made not just for killing, but for dancing through air. And the blade itself, long and curved, was of a steel born from Ottoman lands, engraved with delicate gold script that faded into the years. This was not a warrior's saber, it was a story, a poem without a clear beginning, a piece of memory passed from one empire to another. When archaeologists stumbled upon the saber, deep beneath a crumbling manor in Anatolia, they expected a relic. What they found was something else entirely. A weapon, yes, but also a traveler, a witness, a mystery forged in 3 tongues and speaking none. There were no initials carved into it, no crest, no official mark that could link it to a particular general or king. And yet the craftsmanship, each part made by a different hand, was so deliberate, so intentional, that it couldn't have been random. The grip was made of rosewood, not native to the Ottoman lands. It came from India's southern forests. The gold inlay on the blade was Persian, clearly influenced by 14th century techniques. And the shape of the blade itself followed Ottoman military patterns, but slightly off, as if tailored to someone who had fought in many styles. So whose sword was this? The first theory was romantic, a royal gift. Perhaps a Mughal prince, allied with Persian merchants and married into Ottoman nobility, had this saber forged to represent his new life. It would have been ceremonial, symbolic, a piece never meant to taste blood. But there were scratches, not decorative lines but real scars, from metal meeting metal, from battles, from desperate moments. Another theory emerged. The saber wasn't made for royalty at all. It was assembled over decades, maybe even lifetimes, passed from one soldier to another, modified, repaired, rebalanced. A hilt replaced in Delhi, a guard reshaped in Isfahan, a blade reforged in Istanbul. Not the journey of a king, but of 1,000 steps, of someone who wandered the old empires like a shadow. In a time when borders shifted like the wind, and alliances meant little more than a shared enemy, perhaps the saber had no owner in the modern sense. It belonged to the roads, to the dust, to the ones who survived by not being noticed. Inside the scabbard, hidden beneath the lining, was a surprise. A coin, small, flat, and gold, tucked so deep it could have been missed. It wasn't Roman or Greek. It was Indian, from the Vijayanagara Empire, long gone. Its presence made the sword even older than anyone thought. The coin may have been sewn in as a charm, a blessing, or maybe a secret. People have hidden messages inside weapons for centuries, whispers made solid. In war, where death can come quietly and without warning, such talismans were sometimes the only prayers carried into battle. And yet there was another layer. The saber, upon testing, had metal traces that didn't match any one source. It was forged and reforged, combining materials from the mountains of Persia, the rivers of India, and the sands of Anatolia. It was a melting pot, in steel form. What if it wasn't just made across empires, but made to be an empire? The engravings on the blade, worn but visible under proper light, were not in a single language. Some were Persian poetry, half lines from Hafez, barely legible. Others were Ottoman script, possibly names, lost in age. And the faintest markings near the hilt matched Devanagari characters, Indian script, etched with care. Not decorative, not showy. Just enough to say, I was here, I was theirs, and then I wasn't. There's something quietly powerful about an object that refuses to be claimed, something noble, in a thing that has served many, but belongs to none. In a world obsessed with ownership, the saber stands apart. It wasn't passed down a family line. It wasn't buried in a royal tomb. It was found in a manor cellar, wrapped in a cloth that once served as curtain or shroud, and that feels fitting. Whoever held this saber last didn't keep it for prestige. They didn't mount it above a fireplace or display it for guests. They hid it, carefully, gently, as if the saber held too many memories, too many lives, as if it had seen too much. Maybe it was guilt, or reverence, or maybe they just knew it wasn't theirs to keep. History often wants to tidy things, to place every object in a category. This is Ottoman, this is Persian, this is Indian. But the saber shrugs at those labels. It asks, what if I am all of them? What if I am the story of connection? What if I am the reminder that borders are recent, and empires rise only to fall? But art, craftsmanship, memory, those drift like wind across the land, never truly belonging to anyone. The saber doesn't answer those questions. It rests now in a museum drawer, away from glass and spotlights. Conservators know it's important, but they can't say why. There's no royal seal, no documentation, just a sword, built from 3 worlds, and holding one coin, as if to say, I was here. I walked among kings and thieves. I changed hands without changing form. I belong to no one, and to everyone. And maybe, that's enough. The parade shield that stared back. It wasn't meant for battle. Not really. It wasn't forged to clash with swords or to be cracked by arrows. It was never meant to return from a muddy field, soaked in blood. This shield was made for something else. Something quieter, yet somehow even more powerful. It was made to be seen. Centuries ago, when knights still rode under banners, and honor was wrapped in steel and ceremony, there existed a tradition that blurred the line between art and armor. A parade shield, they called it, though that name hardly captures the strange and haunting beauty of what was found. This particular shield was discovered in the corner of a forgotten castle storeroom, dust-covered, wedged between a rusted cuirass and the remains of a broken polearm. It was oval, almost teardrop-shaped, with a surface that shimmered, not with metal polish, but with layers of paint and pigment, and at the center of it all, a face. Not a symbol, not a crest, but a face. A woman. Serene and cold-eyed, painted with a gaze that seemed to follow you, no matter where you stood. Above her hovered the image of death, grinning, skeletal, holding an hourglass tipped sideways, and below her, a knight. Not charging, not posing, but looking back at her. And suddenly, the question shifts. Who was looking at who? This wasn't just ornamentation, it was a message, or maybe a memory, or maybe a warning. The paint was done in layers, glazes upon glazes, as if the artist was trying to make the figures emerge like phantoms from the surface. The style was unmistakably 16th century European, yet with strange Eastern flourishes, crescent motifs, filigree lining, and subtle uses of blue lapis and crimson, reserved only for objects of great importance. But the more conservators studied the piece, the more confusing it became, because nothing matched. The materials were Italian, the pigment, sourced from Persia. The shield's shape echoed German design, but the portrait style suggested early Flemish portraiture. Like the blade of a saber passed through many hands, this shield had no single origin, and perhaps no single story, and yet it told one. Let's slow things down for a moment. Imagine you're a noble seated beside a hearth as winter snow falls quietly beyond stone walls. Your house steward unrolls a leather wrap and reveals this shield. He tells you it was commissioned by your grandfather, or maybe he says it was captured during a campaign across the Alps. You don't know, but you feel it. You trace the edge of the shield with your fingers. The paint has thinned from age, yet the woman's gaze still holds you. She looks not afraid, not sad, but knowing. There's a kind of stillness to her expression. The knight, just below her, is painted mid-turn, his mouth open just slightly, as if caught in a word he never got to say. It makes you wonder. Was this a real woman, a muse, a memory, or was she entirely imagined? Some believe she was modeled after the commissioner's wife, perhaps painted after her death. Others say she was a representation of fate, seated between man and death, a reminder of what awaits the brave, the romantic, the reckless. But here's where it gets even stranger. Tests on the shield's pigments reveal something odd. The reds used in her lips and cloak weren't typical of the era. In fact, they weren't even European. They came from a rare mineral found only in a small region of northern India, ground into powder and traded along spice routes usually reserved for royal contracts. Why would a ceremonial European knight's shield bear Indian pigments, unless the knight himself had walked those roads? A forgotten journal, found decades later in the archives of a defunct noble family, seemed to reference such a journey. The writer, a man named Lucien of Poitiers, had been sent as an envoy through the Ottoman territories toward the east, part of an early diplomatic expedition. He wrote of a shield painted in Lahore, made for no battle but to speak a truth only seen in silence. Could this be the same one? The shield's backing was made of softened oak, shaped thin but reinforced with riveted bronze, not strong enough to survive a battlefield blow, but more than enough to survive time. Its outer rim held faint engravings, nearly lost to corrosion, that weren't names but numbers. 7 dates, each tied to a known death in the family line of its supposed owner. Not battlefield deaths, not assassinations, just quiet ones. Each death occurred the same week of the year, the second week of November, and the woman's painted eyes, they point not straight ahead, but slightly downward, toward the lower right edge of the shield, where, faint and nearly invisible, another detail emerges. A rose, almost erased by time. A white rose, petals curled back in age, sits beside a tiny painted rabbit, hardly the image you'd expect in a tale of knights and death. But that's the strange thing about the past. It hides meaning in plain sight. The rose might have been a family crest, or maybe it was the symbol of a promise. The rabbit, possibly a childhood nickname or a personal emblem. Some historians believe it was a visual metaphor, innocence lost in the midst of war and love. And yet, we'll never really know. What we do know is that this shield was never raised in battle. It was raised in memory, displayed, maybe once, in a parade or a funeral march, then locked away when the family line ended. Because the final name on the family's lineage scroll ends abruptly, in 1611, just 3 years after the shield was likely painted. And so the shield waited, unseen, unspoken, watching, just like the lady on its surface, a woman who seems to whisper, without sound, to anyone who dares look too long. You may hold the sword, but I hold the reason you lift it. So there it rests now, in a museum far from the castle halls where it was born, lit under low lights, behind glass thick enough to muffle even the weight of wonder. Visitors pass by, some stop, some don't, but the shield always watches back, and the knight still turns his head, forever caught in that single, silent glance. The whisper of Sutri's carved stone theater. There's a quiet road in Italy, far from the grandeur of Rome, the canals of Venice, or the rolling hills of Tuscany. Just outside the small town of Sutri, visitors pass olive groves, broken walls, and hints of an older Italy that never made it into the postcards. But if you follow a narrow footpath along the edge of a hill, something begins to emerge. Not suddenly, but slowly, carved straight from volcanic rock. A curve appears first, then a row of shallow depressions, and finally, an entire amphitheater carved into the living stone. No blocks, no masonry, no decoration, just a perfect elliptical arena hewn from a tufa cliff, as if nature had once tried to mimic the Colosseum, then simply stopped and forgot about it. And for a long time, so did everyone else. Sutri's amphitheater isn't like others in Italy. It was never buried under centuries of city life like the Colosseum, or transformed into housing, fortresses, or churches. It was left open, exposed and silent. And yet for centuries, no one truly understood where it came from or who built it. There were no records, no mention in local histories, no Roman inscriptions, no signs of restoration. In fact, until the 19th century, most people didn't even believe it was Roman. Some said it was Etruscan, others believed it had religious significance, possibly linked to older cults of the underworld. But no consensus emerged. The amphitheater seems to defy explanation. Most Roman theaters were built with quarried stone, then faced with marble or concrete. Even when the Romans carved theaters into hillsides, as they did in Greece, they still used architecture to enhance and support the space. But Sutri's amphitheater is raw. There's no construction. It was just cut from the hillside in one long act of excavation. And maybe that's what makes it feel so different. Standing inside it today, even when it's completely empty, there's a heavy silence. No vendors, no crowds, just the echo of your footsteps, the curve of stone rows, and the realization that this was once alive. People gathered here. They cheered, they laughed, they watched, but no one remembers what they saw. Archaeologists have tried to date it. Most agree it likely comes from the early Roman imperial period, perhaps between the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE. That would make sense based on the layout and design. The arena has clear vomitoria, the passages through which spectators would enter and exit. The rows are tiered, There's evidence of animal containment pits, but there are also strange features. A smaller, secondary entrance cut at an angle, some recesses that don't match known seating styles, and a slope that seems slightly too shallow for large audiences. So what was it used for? Some say it was an experimental structure, possibly built by a local magistrate or wealthy landowner trying to mimic Rome's grand arenas. Others believe it had a dual function, part theater, part religious site. There's even a theory that it was used for private ceremonies, maybe funerary rites, where the public was excluded and the audience was small but significant. Not far from the amphitheater is a Mithraeum, an underground cave temple dedicated to the god Mithras, a deity worshipped in secret by Roman soldiers and initiates. The proximity of that temple has led some scholars to suspect that Sutri's amphitheater may have had a mystical or initiatory purpose. It may have been part of a larger sacred landscape, where performances were spiritual rather than entertainment. And then there's the acoustics. Inside the arena, sounds bounce strangely. A whisper can travel across the oval, while a shout is swallowed by the soft walls. Musicians who've played inside say there's a natural amplification, but also a dampening. It's as if the stone is tuned, not to volume, but to rhythm and tone. That's rare, and it adds fuel to the theory that it wasn't just a theater. It was a space meant to channel human presence in very specific ways. But maybe the most haunting part isn't what it was used for, but that it was left untouched. During the Middle Ages, when most Roman structures were either dismantled for stone or repurposed for defense, Sutri's theater stayed exactly as it was. Some locals used it for grazing animals, others thought it was cursed, and eventually the forest began to grow around it. Trees rose, grass crept up the steps, and the arena disappeared into myth. It was rediscovered properly only in the 1800s when Italian archaeologists began clearing the debris and brush. What they found was astonishing. The stone was worn but intact, the seating still perfectly carved, the entranceways, though damaged, clearly functional. It hadn't been altered, it had simply waited, and so it continues to wait. Today, visitors can walk through it. You can sit on the upper rows, you can stand in the center of the arena and close your eyes, and when you do, you might hear the wind through the trees, the distant hum of the town below, and perhaps, just perhaps, a whisper of what was once spoken here, carved forever into the stone. Not a word, not a name, just the echo of a forgotten performance, and the carved silence of a theater with no script. The hoard that changed Ireland's timeline. The story begins not in a grand museum or a famous battlefield, but beside a quiet lake, still and unassuming. The year was 1980, and local archaeologists had been alerted to something curious near a bog-lined shore in County Offaly. Peat cutters had uncovered a collection of bronze objects, unlike anything they'd seen before. No fanfare, no gold, but what they found would upend centuries of understanding about Ireland's ancient past. It started with a single axe head, but this was no ordinary tool. Its curves, casting marks, and balance all hinted at a deeper story, one that couldn't be explained by the established timelines. Soon, more objects emerged, intricately cast spearheads, tubular horns, rings, socketed axes, and even a few fragments of swords. By the time the excavation concluded, over 200 pieces had been pulled from the marshy soil. This wasn't just a random collection, it was a hoard. The objects dated to Ireland's late Bronze Age, roughly 800 to 600 BCE. But something was wrong. According to previous scholarship, this level of metalworking sophistication wasn't supposed to exist in Ireland at that time. The hoard included techniques that mirrored continental craftsmanship, particularly from Central Europe. It was as if Irish metalworkers had somehow leapfrogged centuries ahead of their known skill level, without any written record, without any outside help. Some archaeologists suggested trade. Perhaps the tools were imported, not made locally. But chemical analysis of the bronze told a different story. The metal came from within the British Isles. This was homegrown, and yet the refinement in form, the repetition in design, and the sheer scale of the hoard all suggested an organized, skilled production system, something previously unseen in Irish prehistory. The location of the hoard was equally mysterious. It wasn't near a known settlement or ceremonial site. Instead, the pieces had been carefully placed in shallow water, one by one. There were no signs of chaos, no evidence of battle or emergency. Just a quiet, deliberate act. Offerings to the lake, perhaps, or a ritual of letting go. This wasn't treasure buried for safekeeping. It was something more symbolic, more sacred. And then came the ripple effect. Once the Offaly hoard was fully catalogued, other smaller finds began to be re-examined. Tools once dismissed as simple were suddenly viewed in a new light. Curators returned to museum drawers. Objects forgotten or misdated were dusted off. Patterns emerged. Rings with the same twists, horns with the same angles, sockets with the same measurements. Ireland, it seemed, had hosted a thriving, sophisticated community of artisans who had their own style, distinct yet connected to broader European trends. This realization didn't just change the timeline, it challenged how archaeologists thought about ancient Irish society. If these artisans existed, who were they serving? Were there elite classes that commissioned this work? Were these tools ceremonial, or everyday objects elevated by skill? Was there a school of training, a guild of sorts? Even more intriguing was what came next. A few years after the Offaly discovery, a similar hoard was unearthed in Northern Ireland, again in a bog, again with high craftsmanship. It suggested that what happened in Offaly wasn't isolated. This was a regional practice, maybe even a cultural norm that had simply gone unnoticed for centuries. The lake where the hoard was found is still quiet today. There are no towering monuments, no ruins, no museums nearby, just reeds swaying in the breeze, and the occasional ripple on the water's surface. But beneath that silence lies a forgotten chapter of Irish ingenuity, one that rewrote the timeline of an entire island, not with a king's crown, not with written chronicles, but with tools forged by hands that knew exactly what they were doing, long before history was ready to admit it. The Civil War gold left in the dirt. When the wind whispers across the rolling fields of Kentucky, it carries with it secrets far older than the plow lines and fence posts. In the soft loam of that countryside, beneath grass that grew wild and undisturbed for decades, a forgotten story waited silently, the kind of story too easily missed, one not written in the pages of a book, but in gold, carefully hidden, then forgotten. This isn't just a tale of money lost. It's a snapshot of fear, urgency, and trust, cast into the earth during the dark days of the American Civil War. It began, as most buried secrets do, in a moment of desperation. The year was sometime between 1863, the Civil War was in full swing. Kentucky, though officially neutral at first, became a place of torn loyalties, where neighbor eyed neighbor with suspicion, and every approaching horseman stirred the fear of raiders or Union patrols. Confederate guerrillas roamed freely in parts of the state, looking for supplies, weapons, and sometimes gold. Gold was everything. It was stability, power, freedom. Paper money was unreliable, easily counterfeited, and subject to wild inflation. But gold, that was real. If you were a wealthy landowner, or a merchant with earnings from years of trade, you did everything you could to protect it. Some fled with it, others exchanged it for property, a few buried it. Somewhere in the fields of rural Kentucky, one of those individuals took what they valued most, over 700 gold coins, and sealed them in the ground. Not hastily, not in the dead of night, but carefully, deliberately, as if they expected to return for them. But they never did. The hoard wouldn't be seen again for more than 150 years. The landscape changed. Farms came and went, trees grew and were cut down, and houses rose and crumbled, and all the while, just beneath the soil, that collection of coins remained. In 2023, the story returned to the surface. A man, walking with a metal detector through his own property, got a signal unlike any he'd heard before, strong, unbroken, and wide. At first he thought it might be junk, a tool, a buried fence post maybe. But as he dug, his spade hit metal, then more metal, and then coins. Gold coins, hundreds of them, so tightly packed, the soil shimmered with them. He called in experts, cautiously. When numismatists arrived, they realized this wasn't just a stash of currency, it was an astonishingly well-preserved Civil War-era hoard. There were $10 and $20 gold Liberty Head coins, minted in cities like Philadelphia and New Orleans. Most were from the 1850s and early 1860s, but one coin stood out, a single, almost mythical piece, a $20 Liberty Head double eagle from 1863, minted in Philadelphia. That coin alone was worth tens of thousands of dollars, but its value wasn't just in its rarity, it was in its message. Why would someone bury such a treasure and never come back? Some say it was a wealthy Confederate sympathizer who feared the advance of Union troops. Others suggest it was a merchant caught between both sides, unsure who would accuse him of treason. Perhaps it was a family secret, handed down verbally and eventually lost when the line broke, when the last person who knew where it was hidden died without passing it on. Historians pieced together a few clues. The uniformity of the coins suggested a single owner, not a collection accumulated over generations. They weren't scattered but clustered tightly, indicating they were likely stored in bags or pouches that had long since rotted away. And the placement? Not random. Whoever buried them took care, choosing a part of the field far enough from any obvious landmarks to avoid detection, yet close enough to remember. But time has a way of erasing even the clearest markers. As for the location, it has been kept deliberately vague. We know it was Kentucky, but where exactly remains a closely guarded secret to protect the site and any remaining traces of the past. This isn't the only hoard found in America, but it may be one of the most fascinating. Because it wasn't a pirate's trove or a lost mine. It was the desperate act of someone caught in the throes of a civil war, trying to preserve something they couldn't carry. And in doing so, they gave us something more than just money. They left a snapshot of life at a crossroads in history. Imagine the scene. A cloudy sky. Horses distant in the wind. Somewhere gunfire in the hills. A man kneels, spade in hand, maybe glancing back at his house. Maybe praying, or maybe just moving fast. He pours the coins into a sack, checks them again, and then drops them into the hole. Covers them with dirt, pats it flat, then leaves. Maybe he planned to return in a few weeks. Maybe he never made it back. Decades passed. Generations came and went, but the gold waited, untouched, silent. Proof that the stories we lose don't always disappear, they just wait for the right hands to uncover them. So the next time you see an open field, quiet and empty, don't assume nothing ever happened there. Beneath that quiet earth, there may be something waiting. A coin, a key, a secret, or 700 of them, glittering in the dark. The shadow of the forgotten emperor's tomb. A chamber deep underground, looted long ago, but still filled with secrets. Deep beneath a silent forest in northern China, far from the buzzing cities and tourist paths, there's a mound that hardly catches the eye. It's just a rise in the earth, overgrown with shrubs and thin trees. But beneath it lies something ancient, carved into the rock and sealed for centuries. The tomb of an emperor whose name most have forgotten, not because he was insignificant, but because history, somehow, let him slip through the cracks. When archaeologists first approached the site, they weren't expecting much. The location wasn't marked on any maps, and there were no surviving records pointing to its existence. It was only when local farmers reported strange sinkholes and oddly shaped stones in the fields that researchers began to suspect something lay below, and once they brought in ground-penetrating radar, it was clear there was a chamber, and not a small one. The tomb had been breached long ago, perhaps centuries earlier. The looters had clearly been thorough. Most of the valuables were gone. There were no jade death suits, no golden crowns, no lacquered chariots, just dust, stone, and the heavy silence of an undisturbed crypt. But something was off. The architecture was more intricate than expected for the time. The ceiling was curved in a way that reflected southern Chinese design, yet the floor tiles bore the markings of nomadic craftsmanship from the north. In one corner of the tomb, buried beneath centuries of debris, archaeologists found remnants of silk, not fragments, but a tangled mess of thread still vibrant in color. It had been preserved by the stable climate deep underground. The silk bore patterns that didn't belong to any known dynasty. They showed creatures, some real, some not, woven in loops around stars, mountains, and what looked like maps. There were suns with faces and rivers that flowed upward. It was unclear if they were decorative or symbolic, or possibly both. At the center of the tomb, where a sarcophagus once stood, there was only an empty platform, no coffin, no bones, just a square space in the stone, surrounded by pillars etched with writings that hadn't been deciphered. They were close to Chinese characters, but different enough to raise questions, possibly an early script, or something entirely different. And yet, the most disturbing find was what wasn't there. No name, no dedication, no stelo, listing his achievements. Whoever this man was, this forgotten emperor, his identity had been erased or never recorded, which, in Chinese burial tradition, is almost unthinkable. Emperors were immortalized through poetry, shrines, tablets, and legends, but here, there was nothing, just silence and shadows. Some historians believe he was a failed usurper, buried in secrecy by loyal followers. Others think he may have ruled briefly in a breakaway kingdom during a chaotic period, and was later erased from official history by rivals. One theory suggests he never ruled at all, but was intended to, only to be betrayed and buried before ever taking the throne. The few artifacts that remained hinted at power: a broken bronze mirror, its edges inlaid with turquoise, a small stone seal that bore the word Tian, heaven, and a carved lion's head, meant to be part of a throne, all buried, discarded, or hidden. Oddly, no human remains were found, no skeleton, not even a tooth. It's possible the tomb was symbolic, built not to bury a body, but an idea, a claim. Or perhaps the looters took the remains long ago, believing in folktales about the power of a ruler's bones. Outside the chamber, archaeologists found a passageway, leading even deeper. It had collapsed ages ago, but sonar imaging suggested another room beyond it. Excavation was too dangerous, the earth above unstable. To this day, that chamber remains untouched. Some believe it holds the true burial site. Others think it was a decoy. Local legends speak of a ruler whose tomb was protected by more than just stone. They say the forest itself watches over the grave, and anyone who tries to disturb the sleeping emperor will be cursed with forgetfulness. They'll lose their path, their memories, their purpose. That's why few villagers go near the mound at night. It's not fear of ghosts, it's fear of being erased. Modern researchers, though, think the curse might be rooted in something else. Perhaps gases trapped in the tomb affect the brain, ammonia, carbon dioxide, even mold spores. It could explain why the original looters never returned, or why nearby wildlife avoids the area. Still, every few years, a team returns to study what they can. They bring scanners, translators, and chemical analyzers, and every time, they leave with more questions than answers. Who was this forgotten emperor? Why was he buried in secret? His name stripped from history? Why was his tomb filled with cultural mixtures from distant regions? And perhaps most haunting of all, what lies in the collapsed chamber beyond the wall? The shadow of the forgotten emperor lingers, not in marble statues or golden masks, but in unanswered questions and quiet echoes. The deeper the researchers go, the more they feel like intruders in a place meant to stay sealed. In the silence of that buried room, history waits, not in bold declarations but in whispers. The ink that never faded. The monk's eternal manuscript. It was supposed to fade. That's what ink does. It weathers. It vanishes into the paper like breath on a cold morning. Yet here it is, 800 years later, still dark, still legible, still untouched by the centuries that erased almost everything else. No one knows who wrote it. No one remembers the monk who hunched over this manuscript night after night, breathing life into letters that would not die. But the ink remembers. The pages remember. And deep within a silent monastery once hidden by fog and forgotten roads, the eternal manuscript waits. It was discovered in the most unassuming place, a small stone library that wasn't even supposed to be there. Nestled in the hills of northern Spain, near a route once traveled by pilgrims, the site was long abandoned. Ivy climbed the walls, the roof had partially collapsed, and inside, most of the shelves were empty. But there, in a locked wooden chest, they found it, a manuscript of staggering clarity. No one had opened that chest in centuries, and yet the script inside looked as though the ink had barely dried. Scholars first assumed it was a forgery, something modern, made to look old. But radiocarbon dating of the parchment told another story. The pages came from the 13th century. The leather binding, though cracked and dry, matched the style of the region's medieval bookbinders. Even the stitching, simple but secure, aligned with known techniques of the era. The book was real, it was old, and still, the ink had not faded. What was it written on? Calfskin or vellum? The finest parchment used by monks during the Middle Ages. Durable, yes, but not immortal. It yellows, it stiffens, and eventually it crumbles. And yet these pages seem to resist even that. Still soft to the touch, still pliable. The colors, deep blacks, warm reds, soft blues, stood vivid. It was as if time had passed the manuscript by. Inside were 214 pages, all of them densely written. No illustrations, no gilded borders, just line after line of text in a beautiful, unfamiliar hand. The script resembled Carolingian minuscule, but not quite. Certain flourishes didn't match any known scriptorium. That's when the theories began. Some believed it was the work of a single monk, a solitary scribe who developed his own style, alone in the wilderness. Others believed it was a collaborative effort, an underground order of writers who passed the manuscript between them over generations. Still others wondered if it had been the final work of a dying monastery, a last attempt to leave behind something perfect before the doors were sealed forever. But it wasn't just the appearance that captivated historians, it was the content. The text wasn't scripture. It wasn't a Bible or a psalter or even a sermon. It was something stranger, a collection of essays, riddles, reflections, and instructions. Some pages read like journal entries, others seemed to be codes or formulas. There were passages that discussed the mixing of pigments, the healing properties of herbs, and strange rituals involving silence, fasting, and solitude. One section detailed how to carve a quill from the feather of a raven, and why ink made from oak galls would outlast ink made from wine sediment. Another passage hinted at a method of ink preparation lost to time. It described ingredients no longer recognized, measurements without units, and a boiling process that required lunar timing, beginning at dusk and ending at the first cry of a night bird. It was poetic, strange, and hard to follow. But those who studied it believed it might hold the key to the manuscript's durability. Some researchers attempted to recreate the ink using these instructions. Most failed. One attempt produced a deep violet ink that darkened over time instead of fading, but even that wasn't stable. No modern formula seemed to match what the monk had done. Somehow, in an age before chemistry as we know it, this anonymous scribe created a substance that refused to die. And then came the ink's other mystery. It didn't bleed. It didn't smudge. Even under a microscope, the strokes were precise, almost too precise. The ink sat on the surface of the vellum like it had fused with it. Experts were baffled. Was the ink alive? Was it reacting to the parchment in a way science couldn't explain? Some samples taken under strict conservation conditions showed compounds unknown to modern analysis. Traces of rare minerals, hints of plant resins long extinct. It was as though the ink had been engineered to bond with time itself. But maybe the strangest part wasn't chemical at all. Some who read the manuscript claimed it changed them. Not in a dramatic, obvious way, but slowly, subtly. One archivist reported dreams about cloistered gardens and bell towers after spending weeks copying the text. Another, a translator, began fasting without realizing it, forgetting to eat for days, immersed in the rhythm of the words. A researcher who read the manuscript aloud said he felt as though someone was listening, though he was alone in the room. Was it suggestion? A kind of literary hypnosis? Or had the monk imbued the manuscript with something deeper than ink? No curses were written in the margins, no warnings, but one line stood out, repeated at the beginning and end of the book in slightly different forms. To read this is to return, to finish is to begin again. A riddle? A spiritual lesson? Or a command? The monastery where it was found offered few clues. The name had faded from local memory, no documents survived, but the architecture dated it to the early 1200s. A small community, no more than 10 monks, must have lived and worked there. Records from a nearby abbey mentioned a brotherhood that spoke little but wrote much, and whose books were gathered like water in the hands of silence. Perhaps this was them. The manuscript remains protected today, housed in a climate-controlled vault. Only select scholars may view it, and only in shifts no longer than 2 hours. Scans exist, but the ink on digital copies looks ordinary, flat, dead. Only the original seems to hold the strange presence. Theories abound. Was the monk a genius chemist ahead of his time? A mystic guided by visions? Did he stumble upon something by accident? Some combination of earth and spirit that merged into eternal ink? We may never know. He left no name, no portrait, no record of where he came from or why he wrote. Just the manuscript, just the words, just the ink that never faded. And maybe that's all he wanted, not to be known, only to be remembered, by the very ink that defied time. The skeleton with sandals in the ice cave. The ice never lies. It holds what the earth forgets, and in the heart of a cave so cold it bites bone, one man waited to be remembered. He did not come with a sword. He carried no banner. He brought no scrolls that history would cling to. He simply lay there, sandals still tied, fingers curled beside him, like he might wake from a dream that froze before it ended. We begin in the Alps, far away from roads and roofs. A narrow path threads along a cliff, treacherous even in summer, but in winter, it disappears completely under sheets of snow. The kind of place only hunters tread, or the desperate, or the forgotten. In 1991, 2 hikers in South Tyrol thought they had stumbled upon a recent tragedy, a body, curled near a meltwater stream, half trapped in ice. But there was no emergency, no rescue required, because this man had been dead for over 5,000 years. He wasn't a mountaineer, he was a mystery. Archaeologists named him Otzi, but that's not his name. We don't know what his people called him, or if he even had a name that echoed after death. We only know what the ice told us, and it told us everything it could. His hair was still there, dark, matted. His skin had turned leathery, like bark from a cold tree. But most haunting of all were his shoes, still strapped to his feet, hand-woven, soft, stuffed with grass, sandals made for snow, built for walking, and yet, they never took another step. They were the first clue, because no one wears straw-filled sandals unless they know what cold is. He had been up there for a reason. Let's walk backwards in time. Strip away the snow, let the glaciers pull back like curtains, let the forest breathe again. There he is, alive. He's not a warrior in the way we picture them. He wears layers, goat leather, woven plant fibers, a bearskin hat. His pack is simple, but his copper axe gleams, a prestige item, not for killing, for showing. He carries a bow unfinished, its limbs not yet strung, so he was still preparing, or maybe fleeing. His hand bears a deep cut, his shoulder holds an arrowhead, buried in bone, and dried blood is streaked down his back. Someone had tried to kill him, or succeeded, but he didn't die where he fell. He moved, wounded, bleeding, determined. He climbed, upwards, toward the pass, toward shelter, and he made it, just barely. Inside the cave, he may have rested, but not for long. The cold wrapped around him, preserved him, held him like a whisper no one could hear, until the ice melted. But why was he killed? Why was he chased? We'll never know. What we have is not a story, it's a puzzle. A belt pouch filled with tools, flint, fungus, and a tiny scraper. Tattoos across his joints, over 60 of them. Not decorative, therapeutic, primitive acupuncture perhaps. He was a man in pain. He was a man who knew pain. The last meal he ate still sat in his stomach. Ibex meat, grains, fat, food of someone who had prepared carefully for his journey. He had plans, but the world had other ones. His sandals, examined closely, tell more than we expected. The stitching was meticulous. The grass changed with seasons, was selected to insulate. He may have made them himself, or they were given by someone who cared. Imagine that moment. You're wounded. You're high in the mountains. You stop to rest in a cave you think is safe. You hear nothing but the wind, and your last sight is snow drifting into the entrance, closing your story forever. It's easy to look at ancient bones and forget they once laughed, that they once built fires, that they waited for someone to return who never did. Ötzi's story isn't just about a murder in the mountains. It's about endurance. It's about a man who kept walking, who tried to live. He never expected his sandals would outlive civilizations, that they would be sealed in frost, until satellites orbited the earth, and strangers spoke languages he'd never heard of. There's something powerful in that in a world of kings and empires, the man we remember is the one who fell alone. His bones didn't change history. They reminded us that history is filled with those who never got a chapter. But here we are, writing his. So when you picture the frozen Alps, think of him, not as a relic, but as a person. Sandals still tied, still walking in the memory of ice. The fortress that faced inward, not out. Beneath a rolling hill, where the wind whispers through overgrown brush, and the stone walls rise like broken ribs from the earth, there stands a ruined fortress, its outer walls still partially intact, its battlements worn smooth by time. There are no signs of recent life here, no torches, no guards, not even distant footsteps, just crumbling stonework, carved arrow slits, and one puzzle that no historian can quite explain. The fortress was designed for war, that much is clear. Its thick walls are constructed with defensive precision, layered stone over packed earth, a structure built to absorb siege after siege. But something is off. Something strange enough to keep archaeologists returning again and again. The loopholes, those thin vertical slits where archers would traditionally stand and fire arrows at advancing attackers, they're not pointing outward, they're aimed in. No one noticed it at first. The entire complex sits on a wide plateau surrounded by lowland forests, and initial surveys focused more on the perimeter walls. It wasn't until a full internal map was drawn up that a student researcher, quietly sketching the view from the inner courtyard, realized that the slits in the eastern tower weren't watching the outside world, they were watching the courtyard itself. From that moment, the site changed. It went from just another ruined outpost to a subject of debate, suspicion, and wonder. Was it built this way deliberately? The earliest records suggest that the fortress was constructed in the late 13th century, though even that's debated. It appears in royal tax documents from 1297, identified only as a hill keep of use to the crown. The name isn't listed, the builder isn't mentioned. No war, no battle, no noble line is directly tied to its foundations, and yet it clearly cost money, time, and labor to erect. It's not a peasant-built structure. The stone is quarried from miles away, possibly hauled by cart or boat. Whoever constructed it had means. But to what end? As archaeologists cleared more of the interior, they found more contradictions. Rooms that made no sense, like a barracks with no latrine, a hall with no hearth, and most unsettling of all, a large underground chamber directly beneath the central courtyard, accessible only through a narrow passage concealed behind a false wall. Inside that chamber, they found shackles, not military storage, not a crypt, just a long low space lined with rusted iron rings embedded in the stone. If this was a fortress meant to protect people from external threats, why had it been built with a prison underneath? And why did every defensive slit point back toward the very place prisoners would have gathered? A medieval psychologist, if such a person had existed, might say this fortress wasn't meant to protect people from the outside. It was built to trap, contain, or possibly punish those inside. The idea took root that this was never a fortress in the traditional sense. It was a prison, masquerading as a keep, a place where the threat wasn't beyond the walls, but already within them. Over time, more oddities surfaced. The only entrance faces north. Strange, because most castles and forts built in this region faced east or south to allow early sunlight into the main halls. The walls are slightly concave, as if to funnel movement inward. The well, which should have been central for ease of access, is off to the side, and was filled with stone before the modern team even arrived. Not sediment, not silt, just rocks, deliberately packed into the shaft, as if someone wanted it sealed. They cleared the well carefully, bucket by bucket, hoping for artifacts, or at least an indication of when and why it had been buried. What they found wasn't comforting. At about 30 feet down, the stones abruptly changed color. The lowest layers were stained red, some sort of iron oxide maybe. But the lab results weren't so quick to confirm. All they could say with certainty was that the rock had absorbed something organic, likely hemoglobin. It had held blood. No records show a massacre here. No stories passed down from nearby villages speak of a rebellion or purge, and yet this silent ruin seems haunted by internal violence. One chamber, located beneath the main hall, had thick stone doors that only opened inward, a locking mechanism on the outside. Inside, the walls were covered in scorch marks, likely from torches or perhaps something more violent. There were no windows, no exits, and at the center of the floor, a ring of iron, embedded into the stone, meant to hold something or someone immobile. This wasn't a place to keep invaders out, it was a place to hold someone in. But who? A few local legends, almost entirely oral, mention a black host, not a ghost, but a man, or perhaps a group, tasked with watching over something, not protecting it, not guarding it from enemies, watching it so it wouldn't escape. The stories are fractured and vague. They reference a crown without a head, a sword buried in breath, and something called the sleeper beneath the keep. What that means, no one knows. But the word sleeper has appeared more than once. A scroll found at a monastery several hundred miles away describes an unnamed outpost where a cursed soul had to be kept locked away. The description of the architecture is eerily close to this very fortress. The document, dated 1341, warns that the watchers must be trained not in war, but in patience, for the evil within cannot die, only wait. A poetic warning, religious superstition, or an actual clue to what this place once was? Could this structure have been the result of fear, not from enemies, but from something deeper? Perhaps a heretic, a cursed royal, or even just a dangerous prisoner of war. Someone or something too dangerous to kill, too dangerous to free, and so they built a fortress around them. Not to keep people out, but to make sure no one ever let them out. The arrows, aimed inward, may have been placed there for precisely that reason. Not to protect the fortress, but to warn the guards. In the deepest chamber beneath the south tower, archaeologists found a final clue. A stone carving, weathered and nearly illegible. It depicts a man seated on a throne, blindfolded, with chains hanging from his wrists and ankles. His mouth is open as if mid-speech or scream. Surrounding him are 7 guards, all with their heads turned away, all blindfolded too. The title etched beneath the image reads simply, "He who must not see the sun." Theories abound. Some say it was a religious prison for those who committed sacred heresy. Others believe it was used to house plague victims in the belief that isolation might save others. A few think the fortress was part of an early psychological experiment, an architectural manifestation of fear and control. But whatever the truth is, the arrows still face inward, silent, still, waiting, and the fortress, now swallowed by vines and forgotten by time, remains a monument not to war, but to something deeper, something darker. Not the enemy at the gates, but the shadow within the walls. The wall that breathed in the desert wind. In the heart of a sunburnt landscape, where even the wind carries silence, there stands a wall. Not grand, not high, not even fully intact, but old. So old, its surface seems to breathe as the wind moves across it. A ripple here, a shift there, and though it was made only of mud and brick, it has outlived empires. This is not a city wall, not a fortress, not a temple. It is something stranger, a wall that stretches for no reason, where there was no one to keep in and no one to keep out. Sand piles along its base, wind stings across its edges, and still the wall holds on. No inscriptions, no carvings, no doorways. But as archaeologists looked closer, they found it wasn't simply built, it was sculpted, layered, pressed in ways that suggested careful hands and ancient knowledge. This wasn't a wall meant for war, it was meant for something else. And then they noticed it, tiny gaps in the construction, slits so narrow they could barely be seen, but when the desert wind picked up, the wall seemed to whistle, long, low tones, like a flute carried across centuries, as if the wall itself was alive, breathing, singing, waiting. Who would build such a thing? Some believed it was ceremonial, a structure to channel wind spirits. Others thought it might be agricultural, redirecting air to cool something long gone, like a garden that once grew where nothing does now. But the mystery deepened, because scattered nearby were fragments of pottery, painted in swirling patterns that looked like waves, ocean waves, and the closest sea was hundreds of miles away. Buried deep beneath the sand, a team uncovered circular foundations, homes, perhaps, or something like homes. But none had roofs, no tools, no bones, no signs of fire, just circles, perfect, deliberate, and silent. The wall curved slightly, not a straight defense, not a border, more like an embrace, and that's when they found the bodies. 3 of them, kneeling, facing the wall, perfectly preserved in ash and dust, no wounds, no signs of struggle, just silence. The soil around them had strange properties, resistant to heat, as if baked in an ancient fire that burned hotter than anything modern, but only in that spot. What kind of fire spares bones and melts rock? What kind of people build a wall to breathe? The bricks were made from a unique mix: mud, straw, and something crystalline. Under microscope, the structure pulsed with mineral life. Not quite organic, not quite artificial, like it knew what it was doing. When night fell in the desert, the wind changed. A different pitch, a higher tone. The wall responded with a hum, a frequency just at the edge of human hearing. Some who stood near it said they felt, watched, not frightened, not even disturbed, just noticed. One archaeologist wrote in her journal, "I stood beside the wall at dawn. As the sun rose, the wind began to move, and I swear, for a moment, the bricks shimmered, not with light, but with memory, like they were remembering every gust, every storm, every hand that touched them." More fragments were found: a disc etched with a spiral, a comb made of shell, a bowl with a single symbol, an eye, with a tear falling inward. What kind of people cried into the eye? Was it a prayer, a warning, or just art? The deeper the teams dug, the stranger things became. Beneath the wall lay another wall, and beneath that, another. 3 layers, each older than the last, each built with different materials, but in the same shape, a memory preserved in earth. In the oldest layer they found charcoal, but it wasn't from wood, it was from something else. Something fibrous, unfamiliar. Even under carbon dating, the material defied easy classification. The wall stood in a place no village should be. No water, no roads, no reason. And yet, it stood. The desert tried to erase it. Time tried to forget it. But the wind remembered. It carried the echoes of voices never recorded, footsteps never mapped, songs never written, and somehow, that wall, simple, humble, quiet, captured all of it. People began calling it the breathing wall. Not because it moved, but because it felt alive. And as technology scanned deeper, something else emerged. Tiny pockets within the wall, sealed chambers, no bigger than a hand, each containing dried seeds. But no two were the same: desert plants, mountain flowers, even seeds from trees that no longer exist. Why embed extinct life into a wall? Was it a vault of memory? A library of silence? A message to the wind? No one can be sure, but one thing is clear: whoever built this wasn't trying to be seen. They were trying to be felt, and now, centuries later, as the sun sets and the wind turns cold, the wall still hums, still breathes, still stands. It doesn't need an answer. It is the answer. The past doesn't always speak in ruins. Sometimes it whispers in the wind, and sometimes it builds a wall that breathes. The coins inside the clay doll's belly. The first thing they noticed was the doll's strange expression. It wasn't joyful, not playful. It had a furrowed brow, a tilt of the chin, and oddly round cheeks. But the archaeologist, brushing away the earth from its body, didn't think much of it at first. They assumed, like many others found nearby, that this was another ordinary artifact, a child's toy lost in time. What they didn't expect was the weight. The clay figure was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. When they lifted it from the sand-packed earth, something shifted inside. Not loosely, but tightly, firmly, as if there was something sealed, unmoving, encased forever. X-rays would later show what fingertips couldn't confirm. Inside the hollow belly of this doll were coins. Not one, not two. A small stack, arranged vertically, as if carefully placed before the final bits of clay were sealed and fired in heat. Coins inside a doll. Hidden, forgotten, intentional. It was unearthed in Anatolia, near the edges of what had once been the great Hittite Empire. A region layered in civilizations, one atop the other. Here kingdoms had risen and vanished like tides, each leaving behind its ruins and riddles. This was not a burial site. It wasn't a temple or a known market. It was a flat plain, once a small village, its buildings mostly gone. But beneath the ruins of a collapsed mud brick home, they found the doll. And as they studied it, more questions bloomed. Why would someone seal coins inside a doll? Was it a form of savings, a child's hidden treasure, a ritual, or something else entirely? The doll was made from terracotta, fired clay with a reddish hue. It had been shaped with careful fingers, not mass-produced, not rushed. Its arms were stubby, its feet slightly pointed, and the face, again the face, something about it felt off. Not childlike, not kind, more serious, more deliberate, and the mouth, just a thin line. The coins were bronze, and strangely worn. Experts believe they dated to the early Roman period, though there was disagreement. A few suggested they might even predate Roman occupation, meaning the doll could be far older than initially thought. But then, why use Roman currency? Unless, of course, the coins were reused, hoarded, or repurposed. One theory proposed this was a form of emergency savings. Imagine a mother, uncertain about the future, hiding her household wealth where no thief would look, inside a toy. If looters came, they'd search jars, boxes, pouches, but not the playthings of a child. But then, a second theory took hold. The coins weren't placed loosely. They were stacked, standing upright in the center of the belly. That required precision. The inner cavity of the doll wasn't a byproduct of shaping. It was made specifically to hold those coins. That made it deliberate, and the doll's weight would have made it unsuitable for children. A child couldn't easily carry it. It wasn't something you'd want to drop, and it wasn't something you'd casually misplace. So maybe it wasn't a toy at all. That's when researchers started digging through ancient rituals. Across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, dolls weren't always for play. In some cultures, they were guardians. In others, vessels used in protective rites or burial customs. Clay figures could be used to represent a person, a prayer, a wish. If one placed coins inside, perhaps it was a form of offering, or maybe a curse, or perhaps a gift for the afterlife. But the doll was not found in a tomb. Still, the idea of symbolic value remained strong. Some researchers suggested the coins might represent something spiritual, tokens for safe passage, or a way to hide value in plain sight. Others believed it could have been used in childbirth rituals. In some regions, terracotta figurines were buried beneath thresholds or near cradles to protect newborns from harm. What if this was such a figure, made for a mother or midwife? Its purpose could have been part protection, part payment. But there's more. When they examined the inside of the doll using micro-imaging, they found burn marks, not just from the kiln, but uneven heat patterns, like it had been exposed to fire after creation. That led to a third theory. The house where it was found may have been destroyed in a fire. A sudden blaze that sealed everything in place. Perhaps the family never returned to retrieve it. The fire, in a cruel way, preserved the mystery. Even the soil around the doll had baked hard, making its recovery incredibly delicate. And while the coins were standard issue, low-denomination bronze, they bore small nicks and damage as if they'd been held, passed, saved, then finally hidden. One bore a partial engraving, illegible but unique. A scratch? A symbol? An accident? We may never know, but it deepens the mystery. Some historians now wonder if there were others like it. Could this have been part of a series? A local tradition? A family practice passed down? But so far, no other dolls like this have been found. Was this a one-time act? A singular expression of hope or fear? Or is it just the only one we've recovered? The artifact is now displayed in a museum under glass, with its belly carefully sliced open to show the stack of coins inside. A model of the original intact sits beside it. Visitors are told the story, but many leave with more questions than answers. Because the truth is, we may never know. A child's toy? A sacred vessel? A desperate hiding place? A ritual for safety? It was sealed with fire. It was buried without a trace. And it was found centuries later, silent, intact, heavy with the weight of a forgotten purpose. The doll may never speak, but inside its hollow chest, a few coins still whisper that someone once cared enough to hide something in the belly of clay. The tunnel too narrow for men. Beneath the sun-baked hills of northern Turkey, there lies a tunnel that has baffled researchers, archaeologists, and even local shepherds for decades. It begins innocently enough, just a shallow depression in the earth, near a grove of fig trees and a dried-up riverbed. But as you peer into the opening, you begin to notice the difference. It's not shaped like a standard passage carved by ancient builders. It's not tall enough for a grown person to crawl through. It's narrow, very narrow. So tight, in fact, that a child would have trouble squeezing inside. And yet, it stretches for miles. It's known only in whispers as the threaded path, and its story, though buried in silence and stone, stretches back over 2,000 years. The first people to discover the entrance weren't researchers. They were villagers trying to install a well. As they drilled into the ground, the machine struck an odd resistance, then slipped into nothingness. A worker lowered a flashlight and was stunned to find a narrow corridor that wound down, bending and twisting like a coiled serpent. But the most shocking part wasn't its depth. It was the perfect uniform shape of the tunnel. Smooth walls, no tools marks, no natural erosion patterns. It was as if it had been molded by something. Initial attempts to explore the tunnel ended quickly. Even the slimmest adult volunteers could only manage a few meters before the walls closed in. The tunnel seemed built for something small. Some suggested it might be an aqueduct. Others thought it was a collapsed burrow system used by ancient animals. But animals don't build in perfect symmetry. And this tunnel didn't collapse. It continued, consistently, patiently, and something had carved it. What's even stranger is what lies at exact 800-meter intervals. Ceramic discs, perfectly round, embedded within the walls, like markers, or gates. Each disc is etched with repeating patterns, some geometric, some organic. Researchers tried carbon dating them, and the results were confounding. The clay showed no signs of being fired, yet it was hardened beyond normal kiln strength, as if it had been baked in pressure, not flame. Theories began to emerge, as they always do when answers are in short supply. One professor suggested it was a ventilation shaft, designed to channel air from underground chambers. But again, the size was the problem. The tunnel was too small to allow airflow to matter at scale. Others floated the idea of message transport, a sort of courier system used by sending scrolls or messages in capsules, pushed through the tunnel from one end to the other. But that too assumed knowledge of the other end. And to this day, no one has found it. As excavations expanded, drones were eventually deployed, tiny ones, built especially for confined archaeological spaces. The drones could only go so far before losing signal, but what they captured in their brief journey changed the tone of the research entirely. At 1.6 kilometers in, the tunnel forked, perfectly. A Y branch, leading in two separate directions, each one continuing the same strange pattern. And just before the split, a small chamber. In that chamber, the drones saw what looked like a carved slab. Not a tablet in the traditional sense, but more like a vertical line of symbols. Not Sumerian, not Luwian, not even anything similar to Anatolian pictographs. It looked alien, but aged. Whatever had written it had done so with purpose. But who or what could fit inside a tunnel that narrow? Soon stories from the nearby village began to resurface. Old ones, passed down quietly. One tale spoke of a serpent road beneath the earth, made not for men but for messengers of the gods. Another spoke of echo tunnels, places where the whispers of the past could be heard if you listened at the mouth long enough. Some researchers now speculate that the tunnel might have served a spiritual function, perhaps symbolic, a symbolic passageway representing the underworld journey of the soul. But again, the construction is too consistent, too literal. Someone meant for it to be used. Then came the most chilling discovery: scratch marks. Just 300 meters into the tunnel, explorers noticed the walls were scuffed, as if something had pushed through. Not once but repeatedly. Not a collapse, not erosion. These were directional. Something had moved through the tunnel, not made it, used it. But what could use such a path? That's where the legends truly begin. One hypothesis centers on the Karakonkolos, a creature from Turkish folklore said to dwell underground and lure people with mimicry. Another theory suggests the tunnel wasn't made by humans at all. Instead, it was used by animals that humans later mythologized. But skeptics of the natural theories point to those ceramic discs. Animals don't embed geometric markers every 800 meters. One esoteric fringe theory even proposes the tunnel was made by a species entirely different from us, a lost, small-statured hominid group, extinct and forgotten. That theory, wild as it sounds, gained traction after a tiny femur was recovered just beyond the 900-meter mark. Its origin remains unidentified. Was it a child? Or someone? Something else? Even more eerie, when archaeologists returned to remove the femur for further testing, it was gone. Not stolen. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the soft dust. Simply gone. Today the tunnel is sealed off from the public. Only high-security research teams are allowed entry, and even they are rarely permitted to enter beyond the 500-meter mark. Locals still avoid the area at dusk, not because of superstition, but because of something far more unsettling: an audible hum, a faint one, as if the tunnel still breathes, still moves, still waits, and every now and then someone will place their ear to the stone, just to check. And when they do, they sometimes hear scratching. From the inside, the tunnel remains a mystery, not a grand pyramid, not a sky-piercing ziggurat, just a narrow, quiet line beneath the earth, too narrow for men. And yet, somehow, not empty.